I had always been drawn to the quiet of the woods, the kind of silence that hums at the edges of your hearing, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves. It wasn't the kind of quiet that makes you feel calm, at least not entirely. It was a living, breathing quiet that demanded attention, that reminded you were a visitor in a place where humans were not the natural rulers. That year, I had decided to spend a week in a cabin I had found on a listing deep in the mountains. It was cheap, isolated, and promised a complete escape from the chaos of the city. I told myself I wanted peace, time to think, to write, to read. The truth was, I craved an experience that would make me feel alive in the most elemental way, and the mountains had always had a grip on me. The drive up was long, winding, and full of narrow turns with sheer drops on one side. The map said I should have been able to reach the cabin in about 3 hours, but the winding dirt roads slowed me to a crawl. By the time I saw the cabin through the trees, the sun was just beginning to drop, streaking the sky with deep oranges and purples. The cabin was small, made of dark wood, with a steeply pitched roof and a chimney that looked long unused. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows were grimy with the dust of decades. I parked my car on the uneven dirt beside the building and stepped out. The air was colder than I had expected, sharp and clean, with a scent of pine and damp earth. I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking ominously under my weight. Pushing open the door, I was greeted by a cabin that smelled strongly of old wood, mold, and something faintly metallic that I couldn't identify. The interior was simple: a small living space with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen with rusted appliances, and a staircase leading to a loft where a bed waited. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, but it felt solid, real. I unpacked my bag, lit a small fire in the fireplace, and tried to settle into the quiet. The first night was peaceful in its own way. I lay in the loft, listening to the wind whip through the trees, and felt the tension of city life dissolve in the dark. But it was a restless peace. Every small sound seemed amplified: the groan of the cabin's wood as it settled, the sharp crack of a branch hitting the roof, the soft scurry of something across the floor below. I tried to ignore it, reminding myself it was probably just a raccoon or a squirrel. Still, sleep was elusive. The next day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. There was a faint trail that disappeared into the trees, and I followed it for a while, marveling at the sheer density of the forest. The trees were enormous, their trunks thick and gnarled, their roots twisting across the ground like veins. I noticed animal tracks in the mud, some fresh, some older. Deer, maybe a fox, possibly even a bear, judging by the size of a few prints. The thought made me uneasy, but not yet afraid. By afternoon, the sun was high and bright, and the forest felt alive in a way that was almost intoxicating. I returned to the cabin with a sense of satisfaction, imagining myself alone with nothing but the fire, the wind, and the trees. That night, though, things began to feel different. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that froze me in place. It was soft at first, a faint scraping against the side of the cabin. My heart raced as I strained to listen. Then it came again, more deliberate, rhythmic, like someone or something was moving along the outer wall, perhaps even trying the door. I told myself it had to be an animal, a raccoon or a deer brushing past the cabin. I stayed still, hoping it would leave, but it didn't. The sound circled the cabin for what felt like hours. I tried to sleep, but every tiny noise made me jump. Eventually, exhaustion overcame me, and I drifted into a fitful, anxious sleep. Morning brought relief and light. The sun filtered through the dusty windows, and I convinced myself the night had been exaggerated by my imagination. I decided to focus on chores, stacking firewood, cleaning the cabin, organizing my supplies. The day passed slowly but peacefully. I even made a small lunch from some canned beans and bread, and sat outside, listening to birds and the wind. By the second night, however, the sense of being watched returned. It started subtly, a shadow flitting just beyond the trees, a rustle that seemed too intentional. I noticed footprints in the dirt around the cabin, larger than any animal I had seen. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. My mind raced. Could someone have been here before me? Did I park my car too close to the road? I had seen no one, but the forest was dense enough that someone could hide and observe without my knowing. The third day was when I realized I was not alone. I had gone to explore a small creek that trickled through the woods. I bent down to fill my water bottle and noticed broken branches around me, as if someone had walked through recently. Then I saw it. A small, crudely made stick figure tied to a tree branch. I felt a jolt of fear. A cold rushed down my spine. The figure had an animal skull at its top, something I couldn't immediately identify, and small tufts of hair attached to it. My rational mind screamed at me to stay calm. It could be hunters, kids, or someone who had passed through months ago, but my gut told me otherwise. Someone had been close, and it felt like a warning. I returned to the cabin quickly, heart hammering, and spent the evening inspecting every corner. Windows, locks, doors, even the chimney. Everything seemed intact, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave. I thought about leaving, but the nearest town was over an hour away, and the roads were narrow and treacherous, especially at night. I decided to double-check the locks and secure the cabin as best I could. I tied my knives to the table legs, moved heavy objects near doors and windows, and made sure the fireplace was ready to provide warmth. Night fell, and the cabin became a pressure cooker of tension. Every sound felt amplified, every shadow suspicious. I lay in the loft with a small knife in my hand, staring at the ceiling. Around midnight, I heard it again. A scraping noise, followed by a soft thump, like someone stepping over the porch. My breath caught, and I stayed perfectly still, listening as the noise circled the cabin. It stopped suddenly, then silence. I waited for what felt like an eternity, too scared to move. Eventually, the wind outside picked up, and the rustling of leaves drowned out any other sound. The fourth day was spent in cautious exploration. I marked my path carefully and discovered more signs. Footprints, broken branches, and small items left behind that looked deliberate, like markers or messages. Each discovery made me more anxious. I realized someone could be watching me, learning my habits, possibly even planning something. I began to ration my food and water carefully, thinking about how long I could survive if I had to hide. I made a mental map of escape routes, studied the road, and even considered camping in a nearby hollow to avoid the cabin entirely if necessary. That night, the intruder revealed themselves in a way I hadn't expected. I woke to the sound of someone or something inside the cabin, the soft creak of a floorboard from below, the metallic scrape of something moving along the kitchen counter. I froze, trying to control my breathing, straining to listen. Whoever it was had no weapons visible, but the intent was clear. They were exploring, searching, perhaps even waiting for me to notice. My mind raced with scenarios. I considered locking myself in the loft, but the intruder was likely aware of the layout, knew every possible hiding place. I remembered the knives, my makeshift barricades, and my firewood. I waited until I heard movement directly below, then threw a heavy log onto the floor. The sound of impact was deafening in the silent cabin, and I heard a startled grunt followed by a rush of movement toward the door. The cabin door swung violently, and I realized they had been trying to enter when I wasn't paying attention. Heart pounding, I grabbed my jacket, my knife, anything I could use, and bolted out the back. Outside, the forest swallowed me immediately. I ran blindly, tripping over roots, crashing through undergrowth, my lungs burning. I had no plan, only the instinct to get as far from the cabin as possible. The darkness of the forest was disorienting, but I kept moving, guided by the faint light of my phone, which I had grabbed in a panic. I stumbled onto the dirt road eventually, and only then did I dare to stop, gasping for air. My car was a short distance away, and I jumped in, locking the doors, shaking uncontrollably. I drove down the winding road as fast as I dared, scanning the trees for any sign of pursuit. None appeared. The isolation that had once been so inviting now felt terrifying. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station in the next town. The lights, the warmth, the presence of other people. It was a relief I hadn't realized I craved so desperately. I reported the incident to the local authorities, who were skeptical but agreed to check the cabin. They found signs that someone had indeed been living, or hiding, near the cabin, possibly for weeks. There were no footprints leading to or from the cabin recently, suggesting whoever it was had retreated into the woods unseen. I never returned to that cabin. The experience left a mark deeper than any physical injury could. It taught me that isolation, while alluring, could also make you vulnerable in ways you can't predict. I moved away from the mountains for a while, stayed in cities where people and lights surrounded me. But the memory of that week, the sense of being watched, the cold brush of fear in the night, stayed with me. Years later, I returned to hiking, but never to cabins. I found safety in open trails, daylight, and known paths. And yet, the memory of the cabin remained vivid, a reminder of the fragility of solitude, the thin line between adventure and danger, and the way the forest could hide someone or something just beyond your vision, watching, waiting, and silent. I had survived, and I had learned, and that clarity, as terrifying as it was, stayed with me. It made me cautious, aware, and alive in a way I could never forget. I had been planning the trip for months, carefully selecting the location, the time of year, and the supplies I would bring. I wanted a cabin in the middle of nowhere, far from towns and other people, a place where I could finally get away from the constant noise and demands of life. I imagined crisp mornings with sunlight filtering through the trees, evenings spent with a fire crackling in the stove, and nights wrapped in thick blankets while the wind whispered through the forest outside. I wanted isolation, but I had no idea how much I would truly experience it. The drive there had been long, winding through highways and then smaller roads that gradually became dirt paths. The further I went, the quieter everything became. No more cars, no more distant voices, no more hum of power lines. Just the wind, the occasional bird, and the creaking of trees. I remember passing a small stream, its water clear enough to see the stones at the bottom, and feeling a small surge of excitement mixed with anxiety. This was exactly what I wanted. Solitude, nature, the kind of peace I couldn't find anywhere else. The cabin itself was tucked into a small clearing, surrounded by thick pines and birches. It looked old, but sturdy. The wooden walls were weathered to a dark gray, and the roof had patches where the shingles had been replaced over time. A small chimney jutted from the roof, though it had no smoke, and the front porch sagged slightly, giving the impression that the cabin had been here a long time. I parked my car nearby and unloaded my backpack and supplies. The air was cool but not cold, and the smell of damp earth and pine needles filled my lungs as I took it all in. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust, old wood, and something faintly sour, like stale air that had been trapped for too long. The floors creaked under my weight, and a thin layer of dust coated the furniture. There was a small kitchen area, a dining table with chairs, a wood-burning stove, and a few cabinets. I checked the stove. It worked, though I would need firewood. Upstairs, there were 2 bedrooms. The larger one had a bed, a dresser, and a small window overlooking the forest. The smaller one was empty except for a mattress on the floor. I chose the larger room and unpacked my things, leaving a few essentials in the kitchen and storing food carefully in the cabinets. That first night, I built a fire in the stove and sat near it, listening to the wind rustle the leaves outside. It was peaceful, but there was also a tension I couldn't explain. Being completely alone in a place like this was not quite what I expected. The forest felt alive in a way I had never noticed before. Every snap of a twig, every creak of the cabin, every distant sound of water or animal movement seemed sharper, more immediate. I lay in bed that night with the window slightly open, and the sounds of the forest surrounded me. At some point, I fell asleep to the rhythm of the wind through the trees, but sleep was restless, fragmented by the unfamiliar noises outside. The next morning, I went for a walk around the cabin, mapping out the small clearing and the path that led deeper into the woods. I collected dry wood and kindling, planning to have enough for several nights. The forest was dense, and the light barely penetrated the canopy in some areas. Birds called intermittently, and I saw a deer disappear into the undergrowth. I found a small creek not far from the cabin, its water clear and cold. I filled my water bottle and traced the creek upstream for a short distance. It was beautiful and calming, but I couldn't shake a small sense of unease, a feeling that I was being watched, even though I knew it was impossible. That night, I lit the stove again and cooked a simple meal. The fire cast long shadows across the walls, and the sound of the flames made the cabin feel both cozy and strangely exposed. I kept the knife I had brought with me close at hand, not because I feared people, but because I had read too many stories about accidents, animals, and the dangers of being alone in the wilderness. I tried to focus on my book, but I kept looking toward the window, watching the dark shapes of the trees move in the wind. It was then that I first heard it, a soft, dragging sound outside. At first, I thought it was the wind moving branches or maybe an animal, but the rhythm was deliberate, uneven, and heavy. It stopped whenever I moved closer to the window, then started again when I stepped back. My pulse quickened, but I told myself it was nothing. There was no one here but me. I didn't sleep well that night. Every little sound seemed magnified. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the creaking of the porch floorboards. Someone or something was moving just outside. I froze, heart racing, listening. The dragging sound was gone, replaced by faint footsteps pacing back and forth across the clearing. I debated staying put or grabbing my backpack and leaving, but I knew that if someone was out there, leaving the cabin would make me even more vulnerable. I stayed in bed, holding the knife, straining to hear anything more. Eventually, the noises stopped, and I fell into a restless, shallow sleep. The following day, I decided to stay close to the cabin, collecting firewood and marking the surrounding area so I would not get lost. Every few hours, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the trees, a shadow that disappeared when I looked directly at it. I found fresh tracks in the mud near the creek, boots, large, heavy soles, leading in a circle back toward the cabin. My stomach sank. Whoever had been outside last night had left tracks, but I didn't hear anything during the day. That afternoon, I barricaded the doors as best I could, stacking firewood and heavy furniture to make the cabin more secure. I realized I had underestimated just how vulnerable I was in a place like this. That night, I lit the stove again and cooked a simple meal. The fire cast long shadows across the walls, and the sound of the flames made the cabin feel both cozy and strangely exposed. I kept the knife I had brought with me close at hand, not because I feared people, but because I had read too many stories about accidents, animals, and the dangers of being alone in the wilderness. I tried to focus on my book, but I kept looking toward the window, watching the dark shapes of the trees move in the wind. It was then that I first heard it, a soft, dragging sound outside. At first, I thought it was the wind moving branches or maybe an animal, but the rhythm was deliberate, uneven, and heavy. It stopped whenever I moved closer to the window, then started again when I stepped back. My pulse quickened, but I told myself it was nothing. There was no one here but me. I didn't sleep well that night. Every little sound seemed magnified. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the creaking of the porch floorboards. Someone or something was moving just outside. I froze, heart racing, listening. The dragging sound was gone, replaced by faint footsteps pacing back and forth across the clearing. I debated staying put or grabbing my backpack and leaving, but I knew that if someone was out there, leaving the cabin would make me even more vulnerable. I stayed in bed, holding the knife, straining to hear anything more. Eventually, the noises stopped, and I fell into a restless, shallow sleep. The following day, I decided to stay close to the cabin, collecting firewood and marking the surrounding area so I would not get lost. Every few hours, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the trees, a shadow that disappeared when I looked directly at it. I found fresh tracks in the mud near the creek, boots, large, heavy soles, leading in a circle back toward the cabin. My stomach sank. Whoever had been outside last night had left tracks, but I didn't hear anything during the day. That afternoon, I barricaded the doors as best I could, stacking firewood and heavy furniture to make the cabin more secure. I realized I had underestimated just how vulnerable I was in a place like this. That night, I kept the fire going much longer than usual, its warmth and light a small comfort against the darkness. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and the walls. Around midnight, I heard it again. The dragging sound, heavier this time, closer. My heart pounded in my chest. I stayed perfectly still, listening as the footsteps circled the cabin, paused, then moved away, only to return a few minutes later. I couldn't see anything through the small windows, and I refused to step outside. I thought about calling for help, but my phone had no signal. Panic clawed at me, but I forced myself to breathe, counting slowly to 10, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and I fell into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I inspected the perimeter. There were no footprints outside the porch, but in the mud near the trees, I saw them again. Heavy boots, deep impressions that circled the clearing. They looked fresh, as if whoever had made them had been there just a few hours ago. I realized I was trapped in a very real sense. The nearest road was miles away, and anyone walking there would not pass by until the next day at the earliest. I gathered all my supplies, keeping the knife close and my backpack ready. I knew I could not stay in the cabin forever. For the next 2 days, I alternated between exploring cautiously, reinforcing the cabin, and staying inside, trying to convince myself I was safe. The dragging sound returned each night, sometimes slow, sometimes fast, sometimes near the window, sometimes circling the cabin. I became hyper-aware of every sound: the rustle of leaves, the snapping of branches, the hum of insects. My nerves were frayed, my sleep minimal. I found a small window at the back of the cabin, low to the ground. I considered escaping through it, but the surrounding forest was thick, and I knew I would not get far without being seen. On the third night, I heard something different. Voices, low and muffled, coming from the trees. They were indistinct, but definitely human. I pressed myself against the wall, heart hammering, knife clutched tightly. The voices moved closer, pausing at the edge of the clearing, then retreating. I realized with growing dread that whoever had been circling the cabin was still out there, watching, waiting, testing me. I had to act. I could not stay any longer. At first light, I packed everything I could carry, leaving behind the bulkier items I couldn't manage alone. I left a note inside the cabin, in case anyone came later, explaining where I had gone. I chose a path through the forest that led toward the creek and the main dirt road, moving quietly, deliberately, keeping my eyes and ears open. The forest seemed more oppressive than ever, every shadow a potential threat. I moved slowly, listening for footsteps, keeping my knife ready. At one point, I stumbled over a root and fell, scraping my knee. The sound seemed deafening, and for a moment, I froze, expecting to see someone emerging from the trees. No one appeared. I kept moving, limping but determined. Hours passed. The forest thinned slightly, and I eventually reached the main dirt road. Relief flooded me when I saw the familiar stretch of open path, though I stayed hidden behind a tree for a long time, watching and listening. When no one appeared, I began walking toward the nearest town, keeping to the shadows, moving slowly but steadily. My legs ached, my body was exhausted, and my mind was on high alert. I kept my knife close, ready for anything. By late afternoon, I reached a small convenience store on the edge of town. I stumbled inside, and the clerk immediately noticed my disheveled appearance. I bought water and some food, then collapsed on a chair in the corner, trembling. The sense of danger that had been constant for days began to fade slightly. I called the local police, explaining my situation, and gave them the location of the cabin. They assured me they would investigate. The next morning, deputies arrived at the cabin. They found no one there but evidence that someone had been staying in the surrounding woods. Campfire remnants, trash, and footprints. The officers said it was possible someone had been watching the cabin for days, maybe living off the land, but there was no way to be sure. I returned to the cabin with them, seeing the place in daylight. What had seemed safe and inviting days ago now looked exposed and vulnerable. I realized that isolation comes with risks, and that even the most peaceful settings can hide very real dangers. In the weeks that followed, I stayed in town, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. but gradually, the fear receded. I never returned to the cabin, and I made a promise to myself that my desire for solitude would always be tempered by caution and preparation. I had survived, but the experience left a lasting mark. I understood now that being alone in nature is not just about peace and beauty. It's also about awareness, readiness, and respect for the unpredictable world around you. Eventually, I was able to sleep normally again. I started hiking and camping in more controlled settings, places with other people nearby, where help was not too far away. I kept the knife, the planning, and the heightened awareness, but the constant fear was gone. I had faced a real danger, one that had nothing to do with ghosts or stories, only the stark reality of being alone and vulnerable in the wilderness. And I had made it through. I look back on that trip often, remembering the quiet, the forest, the cabin, and the fear that never let me rest. I learned lessons that cannot be taught in books or by experience alone. They are learned by being present, alert, and alive in the face of uncertainty. I survived, and in surviving, I learned more about myself than I could have imagined. That cabin, that forest, the sounds in the night, they remain vivid in my mind, reminders of both danger and resilience. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. The city was suffocating me. The noise, the traffic, the endless stream of people and responsibilities. I needed to disappear for a while, just to breathe, to remind myself what silence felt like. I found the cabin online, tucked away in the mountains of northern Idaho, miles from any small town, closer to trails than to anything else. The pictures made it look like a postcard. A small wooden structure, surrounded by pines, smoke curling from the chimney, the sun glinting off a nearby stream. I convinced myself that spending 3 days alone in that cabin would reset my mind, my body, my whole life. I had taken plenty of solo trips before, but this one felt different. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe it was the fact that for the first time in years, I wouldn't answer to anyone, not even to the faintest expectation. The drive was long. My car rumbled along winding mountain roads, the asphalt narrowing, then disappearing altogether into gravel paths that seemed barely wide enough for one car. The air changed as I climbed higher. The scent of pines, wet soil, and with smoke filled the cabin long before I arrived. By the time I reached the final curve, the sun was low, golden light filtering through the trees, and the cabin emerged from the forest like a secret the mountains had been keeping. I parked in the small clearing, my tires crunching on dead pine needles and gravel. I paused for a moment, taking in the view. The air smelled cold and pure, carrying a hint of smoke from the fireplace. I could hear the stream, a faint rush of water over rocks, soothing and steady. I thought I had reached a haven. The cabin itself was small, maybe a single bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a loft with a bed, and a main room with a fireplace. The wood smelled faintly of cedar, warm and comforting, and the furniture was rustic but solid. There was a stack of firewood by the door, enough for a week if used sparingly. I unpacked my bag slowly, taking my time to arrange things just so. The act of preparing the cabin was almost meditative, the small chores grounding me in the reality of my isolation. I lit the fire just as dusk fell, the flames crackling and filling the room with a soft warmth. Outside, the forest began to darken, shadows stretching and growing long. I could hear the occasional snap of a twig, the distant sound of an animal moving through the undergrowth. My first night was peaceful. I ate a simple dinner, read a few pages of a book I had brought along, and eventually fell asleep to the quiet, the subtle noises of the forest like a lullaby. The next morning, I woke to a sky painted with pale pink and gold. I made coffee over the small stove, the aroma filling the cabin, and ate a light breakfast. I had planned to explore the surrounding trails, to stretch my legs and absorb the wilderness, so I packed a small backpack with water, snacks, a map, and my phone. The map was basic, a folded sheet marking some main paths, streams, and a few rock formations, but it was enough to give me confidence. I set off along a trail that ran parallel to the stream, the gravel crunching under my boots. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and damp earth, and a faint breeze carried the scent of moss and decaying leaves. I walked slowly, paying attention to the sounds around me. The rush of water, the hum of insects, the occasional call of a bird. Every step made me feel lighter, almost as if the weight of the city and all its demands were melting away. Hours passed. I wandered through thick pine forests, over roots and rocks, following the trail as it curved up a ridge. The climb was steep, and my legs burned, but the view from the top was worth it. The valley below was a patchwork of green and brown, dotted with streams and rocks, and in the distance, the faint outline of other ridges rose like dark waves. I stopped for water and sat on a boulder, just breathing, letting the silence of the mountains sink in. But as I looked around, I noticed something odd. Footprints. Not animal prints, human. They were fresh, the mud still soft and impressionable, leading deeper into the forest. My first thought was curiosity. Maybe someone else was hiking this trail. The idea was comforting at first. It was proof I was not completely alone. I followed the prints cautiously, telling myself I would just see where they went. But the deeper I went, the more the forest changed. The trees grew denser, the underbrush thicker, and the trail became less obvious. I realized I hadn't seen a single sign of civilization for over an hour, not even the faint sound of a road or the chirp of a distant bird. Then I noticed something else. The footprints had stopped. The mud showed no continuation, no hint of where the person had gone. I looked around, the forest suddenly quieter, as if holding its breath. The branches above blocked the sun, and shadows fell like curtains across the ground. Unease prickled my skin. I tried to reassure myself. Maybe the person had turned off the trail. Maybe they had moved fast. But the feeling of being watched was undeniable. I shook it off, told myself I was imagining things, and decided to head back to the cabin. The return trip was slower than I expected. The forest looked different now, ominous in the dim light of late afternoon. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me tense. I kept my eyes scanning for movement, for anything out of place. That's when I saw it. A figure partially obscured by trees, standing still and staring. My heart froze. I wasn't sure if it was human, but the posture was unmistakable. The figure didn't move, didn't react, just watched. I froze for a moment, then slowly backed away, keeping it in my peripheral vision. The figure didn't follow, didn't move at all, but the dread in my chest was impossible to ignore. I quickened my pace, almost running, until finally the trees thinned, and I could see the clearing where the cabin sat. Relief washed over me, but it was tinged with a raw edge of fear. That night, I made sure every door and window was locked. I stacked extra firewood against the front door and arranged the chairs in a defensive perimeter. An irrational gesture, but one that made me feel safer. I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the cabin, every whistle of wind, felt amplified. I kept imagining movement outside, shadows shifting just beyond the window. I could hear animals, sure, but I kept catching glimpses of shapes that didn't belong. Morning was a relief. The sun came through the windows, the warmth of daylight banishing some of the terror of night, though not all. I spent the next day trying to reclaim a sense of normalcy. I cleaned, organized my supplies, and even started a small journal, noting down everything I had seen, felt, and heard. The act of writing calmed me, but the forest outside was restless. I began noticing subtle signs. Rocks arranged in strange patterns, branches bent in odd directions, the faintest signs of someone, or something, having been close to the cabin. At first, I dismissed it, telling myself it was just wind, or animals, or my imagination. But by the third day, the feeling of being watched was undeniable. It was late afternoon when it happened. I was outside, chopping wood for the fireplace, when I heard a low, deliberate crunch behind me. I froze, hand on the axe, muscles taut. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line. A man emerged, plain clothes, a hat pulled low, his hands empty but his posture rigid, controlled. My heart pounded, and for a moment I thought I was going to faint. He didn't speak, didn't approach, just stood there, staring. I felt trapped. The cabin was behind me, the forest stretching endlessly in front. I made a slow, deliberate decision. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I reached the cabin and slammed the door, locking it again. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Panic gnawed at me, but I forced myself to think. The cabin had one large window at the front. I pulled the curtains closed and barricaded it with a chair. Then I remembered the fireplace. The cabin had a chimney flue that opened to the outside. I thought if I could get onto the roof, I might be able to signal for help, or at least see where he went. I climbed carefully, the wooden shingles groaning under my weight. From the roof, I could see the man below, moving slowly, scanning the clearing. He didn't leave. He just waited. Night fell again, and I stayed awake until dawn. I had no plan other than to survive until daylight. I kept the fire burning, hoping it might deter him, though I wasn't sure it would. I listened to every sound, trying to distinguish normal forest noises from him. Finally, first light crept through the trees. I dared to open the door just a crack. He was gone. I didn't wait to process relief. I grabbed my bag, locked the door, and ran to the car, my heart hammering, muscles burning. The drive down the mountain was tense. Every shadow, every curve, every branch against the windshield set my nerves on edge. But finally, the trees thinned, and the roads became familiar again. When I reached the first gas station, I called the local authorities, gave them the address, the description of the man. They said they would send someone to check the area, but I couldn't wait. I drove the rest of the way to the nearest town, where I found a motel and collapsed in a room, shaking, exhausted, but alive. Days later, the police called. They had found evidence near the cabin. Tracks, signs someone had been watching for days, a small camp set up in the underbrush. No one was caught, and the man's identity remained unknown. I never returned to that cabin. But I learned something about myself. That terror doesn't always come from ghosts or monsters. Sometimes it comes from another human being, and that knowledge is heavier than any fairy tale. I never stopped thinking about that figure, the silent menace in the trees. But I survived, and I came away with a sharp awareness of how thin the line is between peace and danger, and how careful you must be when you step into the wilderness alone. I had been planning the trip for months, a quiet escape into the woods to spend a week alone in a small cabin far from any town. The cabin was supposed to be a refuge, a place where I could disconnect from work, from the noise of the city, from everyone. I found it listed on a small rental site, a rustic wooden cabin nestled deep in a forest in the mountains. From the photos, it looked isolated but inviting, surrounded by tall pine trees, and with a small lake just a few hundred meters away. I told myself I wanted solitude, and this was exactly what I was looking for. I arrived in the late afternoon. The sun was low, slanting through the dense forest in a warm, golden glow. The gravel road had been rough, the kind where even a small car bounces and rattles with every rock. I had driven slowly, making sure not to get stuck or damage the tires. The GPS signal had been spotty for the last few miles, and I relied mostly on printed directions the owner had sent me. When I finally saw the cabin, I felt a wave of relief. It was small, maybe 20 feet across, with a single story. The wood had aged but looked sturdy. A stone chimney rose from one end, blackened at the top from years of use. A small porch ran along the front, with a couple of old chairs that creaked if you leaned on them. The first thing I did after parking was unload the car. I carried a bag of groceries, a small cooler, and my backpack into the cabin. Inside, it smelled faintly of wood and old smoke. The floor was worn pine, and a few simple pieces of furniture. Table, chairs, a couch, and a bed were all I found. The kitchen was tiny but functional. A small fridge, a propane stove, and a few cabinets with basic utensils. There was a stack of firewood beside the fireplace. The windows had latches but no screens, and the glass was a little foggy in places, giving the whole cabin a kind of muted, distant view of the forest outside. I spent the first hour just walking through the cabin, checking everything. The water ran from a small pipe in the sink, the toilet worked, and the heater functioned on propane. I made myself a sandwich and sat on the porch for a while, watching the sunlight move through the trees. The forest was quiet. No birds were singing, at least not close by, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a crow. I felt an initial sense of peace, the kind that comes from knowing you are completely alone and there is nothing you have to do but breathe and be. As evening came, I started a fire in the fireplace. The wood was dry, and the flames caught quickly, filling the cabin with warmth and a soft, crackling light. I made dinner on the small stove, a simple meal of pasta and sauce, and ate while sitting on the couch. Outside, the sun had gone down, and the forest had shifted from gold to deep shadow. The air cooled quickly. The mountains always made the nights colder than you expect. I closed the windows, checked the locks on the doors, and settled in for the night. The first night was calm. I slept in the bed, wrapped in the thin quilt the cabin provided, and woke briefly to the sound of wind in the trees. Sometimes I thought I heard something moving outside, a branch scraping or an animal passing through the brush, but I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. The forest was alive with small creatures. I was the only human here. The next morning, I woke early to a clear sky. I made coffee on the stove and sat on the porch, sipping slowly and watching mist rise from the lake. The air smelled of pine and wet earth. I decided to explore a little, walking along a narrow trail that led down to the water. The trail was uneven, roots and rocks making it tricky to walk. The lake was small and quiet, surrounded by trees that bent low to the water. I sat for a long time, just listening to the occasional splash of fish or the distant buzz of an insect. The isolation was profound. There was nothing around for miles but trees, rocks, and water. That night, something changed. I was preparing dinner again, stacking firewood and setting a pot of stew on the stove. I heard a sound outside, faint but distinct, a snap of a branch close to the cabin. I froze. The sound had come from near the back, behind the cabin. I waited, listening. Nothing. I tried to convince myself it was a deer, just a normal forest sound. I went back to cooking. But then, minutes later, I heard it again, this time followed by a rustling in the underbrush. I put the stew on the stove and slowly walked to the window. The cabin's back faced a small clearing, maybe 10 meters wide before the forest thickened again. I peered out into the darkness, straining my eyes. The moon was partially covered by clouds, making it hard to see. Then I caught a shadow moving. Something or someone was standing at the edge of the clearing, just barely visible between the trees. My heart raced. I immediately thought it could be a hiker or a camper who had gotten lost. I grabbed my flashlight, aiming it toward the clearing, but when the beam hit the spot where I had seen movement, there was nothing. No shape, no sound, just the wind in the trees. I convinced myself it had been a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the branches. Still, I felt uneasy. Over the next 2 days, the feeling worsened. I stayed mostly inside the cabin, venturing out only during the day. I began to notice small things. Footprints in the soft earth near the cabin, snaps of twigs when no animals should have been near, a faint smell of smoke in the air at night, though I hadn't lit a fire outside. One night, I was woken by a sound I couldn't place. A scraping at the back door. My stomach dropped. I had locked it and the glass was thick. I sat in bed, heart pounding, listening. The sound stopped after a few seconds, and when I checked in the morning, there was no sign of anything. By the 4th day, I was starting to feel trapped. The isolation that had been peaceful now felt oppressive. I began checking my phone more often, hoping for signal, but there was none. No service. I considered hiking back to the road, but the trail was uneven, and I didn't want to risk getting lost. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the forest made ordinary sounds that seemed sinister at night. Still, the sense of being watched never left me. On the 5th day, the situation escalated. I was sitting at the table, working on my laptop, when I heard a loud crash outside. It sounded like someone had thrown a heavy branch against the side of the cabin. I froze. The sound came from the far side, near the trees, where I couldn't see from the windows. I grabbed the small axe I kept by the fireplace for emergencies and walked cautiously to the back door. My hands were shaking. Outside, I saw nothing, no movement, no figure, but the forest felt different. The wind had stopped. The usual sounds of birds and insects were gone, replaced by an unnatural silence. I stayed inside the cabin the rest of the day. I barricaded the doors with furniture, stacked firewood against the back door, and kept a knife and the axe close. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room, flashlight in hand, watching the shadows. Every noise made me tense. An animal moving, a branch falling, the wind shifting. I tried to convince myself again that it was a prank, maybe a hunter seeing a cabin in the forest, but the more I thought about it, the less plausible that seemed. The next morning, I decided I had to leave. I packed what I could, keeping essentials in my backpack, and got my car keys. I planned to hike down the trail to the road and drive out, but as I opened the back door, I froze. Footprints, large, muddy, and human, led away from the cabin into the forest. They were fresh. They didn't match mine. My heart raced. I didn't know if whoever had made them was still around, watching from the trees. I debated whether to go out the front door instead, but I knew it would be the same. The cabin sat alone in the clearing, visible from all sides with no cover. I took a deep breath and ran. I ran down the narrow trail toward the road, backpack bouncing against my shoulders, axe in one hand. My ears strained for any sound behind me. Branches snapped, leaves rustled, but I couldn't tell if it was me or someone following. After what felt like an hour but was probably only 20 minutes, I reached the gravel road. Relief washed over me. The road was empty, but at least I was out of the immediate forest. I ran until I reached the main road and eventually flagged down a car passing by. The driver didn't ask many questions, just gave me a ride to the nearest town. I called the local sheriff's office once I was safe. They took a report and said they would check the area, but the cabin was isolated, and it could have been anyone, hunter, trespasser, or someone using the woods to hide. I didn't stay to find out. Looking back, the cabin was beautiful, the forest serene during the day, but at night, it became a different world. The isolation that had promised peace turned into a pressure, a weight, and the unknown presence, whatever it was, made it terrifyingly real. I learned a lot about myself in that week, about fear and intuition, and about how quickly solitude can become danger if someone else is out there with you. I never returned to the cabin, and I never planned to, but I still remember every detail: the smell of the forest, the feel of the cold air, the sound of branches breaking at night, and the sight of those footprints leading into the trees. I had wanted isolation, and I got it, but not in the way I imagined. That week left a mark, a memory that will stay with me, a reminder that some places are better admired from a distance. I had been planning the trip for months, thinking it would be the kind of escape that every person dreams of at least once in their life. The cabin I rented was deep in the mountains, far from any real town or road that mattered. The GPS barely worked, showing jagged lines over green stretches that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't been there. I told myself that this was exactly what I wanted. A place where the wind was the only sound, where the trees in the dark would cover me like a blanket, and where I could forget the pressure of everything else. The drive had taken longer than I expected. What looked on the map like a smooth route turned into a series of bumpy, narrow paths, lined with trees that arched overhead so close they almost touched. At times, I had to slow down to crawl under low branches or carefully maneuver around sharp rocks. I could feel the tension in my shoulders growing with every mile, but I tried to convince myself it was part of the adventure. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was just dropping below the ridge, casting long shadows that stretched into the valley behind it. The cabin looked small at first, almost fragile, made of old timber, with a stone chimney that reached toward the sky. The windows were dusty and slightly cracked, but it had a certain charm, a sense of being untouched for decades. I parked the car as close as the terrain allowed, the tires crunching over dry leaves and uneven stones, and I climbed out. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the smell of pine, wet earth, and the faint metallic tang of distant water. I started exploring the cabin immediately. Inside, it smelled of aged wood and mildew, but in a way that didn't feel unpleasant. It was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that made your ears strain to pick up the smallest creak. The main room had a stone fireplace, empty but imposing, and a set of old furniture, tables, chairs, and a sofa that had clearly been there for a long time. The windows were dirty, but I could see the forest pressing in on all sides. The kitchen was basic, with an old stove and a sink that I tested to see if the water worked. Surprisingly, it did, though the water smelled faintly earthy. The bedroom upstairs was simple: a mattress on a wooden frame, a dresser with drawers that creaked, and a small window that looked out onto the forest. I unpacked slowly, trying to convince myself that being alone here wasn't scary. I lit a few candles in case the power failed and started a small fire in the fireplace. The crackling of the flames made the room feel alive, like it was breathing with me. As night fell completely, the sounds of the forest became more distinct. I could hear the wind rustling through the pine needles, and at times, the sharp snap of branches breaking somewhere beyond the clearing. Every so often, I thought I heard footsteps crunching on leaves outside, but when I went to the window, there was nothing. The forest was still, except for the moving shadows that the moonlight made. I told myself it was just my imagination. Around midnight, I realized that my phone had almost no signal. A text I tried to send took 5 minutes to go through, and even then, I didn't get a reply. I thought about the isolation for the first time with a real sense of concern. Out here, help wouldn't arrive quickly, if at all. I decided to stay calm, reminding myself that cabins like this existed for people who wanted solitude. I tried to sleep, but the cabin seemed to change once it was fully dark. Small noises became larger, the creaks of the wood sounding like footsteps moving closer. I would wake up every hour, heart racing, convinced someone had entered the room. Yet, the locks on the doors were solid and no windows were broken. I spent the night tense, barely resting, waiting for morning. The next day, I explored the surroundings. The cabin sat near a small, narrow stream, half hidden by undergrowth. I followed it briefly, noticing broken branches and faint tracks, but none of them seemed human. The forest around the cabin was dense, almost suffocating, with twisted roots and low-hanging branches that made walking difficult. As I walked, I felt increasingly like the forest was watching. Every rustle in the leaves, every snap of a twig, made me freeze. By the second night, the tension became almost unbearable. I had brought a knife and a small hatchet, placing them next to the bed, even though I doubted I would need them. I started to notice odd things: small footprints near the cabin, disturbed stones around the perimeter, and items I thought I had placed neatly inside slightly moved. Nothing was overtly dangerous, but it made me uneasy. I kept telling myself that it was probably animals, deer, raccoons, something harmless. Then came the third night. A storm rolled in unexpectedly. The wind howled through the trees, making the entire cabin shudder. Rain pounded the roof, and the fireplace I had carefully maintained sputtered under the strain of the wet air. I tried to stay calm, listening to the storm, but around midnight, I heard something much closer than the wind. A loud thump, followed by dragging sounds outside the cabin. Something large, heavy, moving along the ground, brushing against the walls. I froze, unable to breathe, waiting. The sound came again, then silence. I crept to the window, trying to look out without being seen. Rain streaked the glass, and the darkness of the forest made it impossible to see clearly. But I thought I caught a glimpse of movement, dark shapes moving low to the ground. I stayed awake for hours, fire nearly gone, knife in hand, barely daring to breathe. At dawn, I forced myself outside. The forest was wet and quiet, littered with broken branches. The snowless earth was churned up in places, showing the tracks of something big. It wasn't human, that much was clear. I followed them cautiously, trying to stay calm, until they disappeared into a swampy area. My mind raced with possibilities. I wasn't dealing with another person. No one would dare come this far. But the idea of large predators or an unknown wild animal was very real. I spent the next day boarding up windows and checking the perimeter. The cabin, while strong, had vulnerabilities. Any animal or human could break in if determined, but I felt safer inside. I stocked the fireplace, made sure I had water, and kept the knife and hatchet within reach. Still, each sound outside, each snapping twig, made my heart jump. On the fourth night, I decided to sleep in the bedroom with the window locked and curtains drawn, even though it felt suffocating. The storm had passed, leaving the forest dripping and silent, but I could hear faint scratching and movement just outside. Sleep came reluctantly, in short bursts, my body tense and ready to react. I realized that being alone in the wilderness wasn't like being alone in a city apartment. Every sound had meaning here, and every shadow could hide something dangerous. By the fifth day, I decided I couldn't stay indefinitely. I packed a bag with essentials and prepared to hike out, following the stream that led to a main trail. The cabin, which had once seemed so inviting, now felt like a trap. The forest had shifted from beautiful to oppressive. As I walked, I noticed more signs of the previous nights. The tracks, broken branches, disturbed soil. I stayed alert, moving cautiously, knife in hand. Eventually, I reached the trail. By mid-afternoon, I saw the faint outline of a road in the distance. I ran toward it, adrenaline making my legs strong. When I reached the road, I found a hiker and asked for directions to the nearest town. My first taste of human contact in 5 days was overwhelming. I explained briefly, without detailing everything, just enough to feel safe. I didn't go back to the cabin. Later, I learned from locals that large predators, probably a bear or maybe even a rogue wolf pack, had been spotted in that area. The tracks I had seen matched those sightings. It explained everything: the sounds, the movement, the fear. What I thought might have been paranoia or some unseen intruder was simply nature being untamed and dangerous. I realized then that survival sometimes isn't about heroism or preparation. It's about paying attention, respecting the wilderness, and knowing when to leave. The cabin was beautiful, yes, but in the end, it was a reminder of the real threats that exist in the world, quiet and patient, waiting just beyond the door. I never went back, and I never forgot the fear that had been so constant, so immediate. But I also didn't regret the experience. I learned how fragile human safety can be, how easily it can be stripped away, and how clear the line between comfort and danger is when you step into the wild. I remember the first time I ever drove up the dirt road to that cabin. It was late October, the kind of October that carries a wet cold into your bones even through layers of clothes. The forest all around was a mixture of dark green pines and bare brown maples, their branches like thin fingers scratching the sky. I had been looking for a quiet place to get away, to escape the city, to escape everything really, and I thought a cabin deep in the woods would do the trick. I had found it online, advertised as remote and secluded, with only a narrow trail leading to it. That alone should have set off some kind of warning in my head. But it didn't. I was too tired of people, too tired of noise, and too tired of myself to care about anything else. The drive up the road was worse than I expected. It was narrow, lined with rocks and roots that jutted out from the earth, making it impossible to go fast. The leaves that had fallen formed a thin orange carpet, but the wetness beneath made the tires slip slightly. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter as I rounded a bend and caught my first real glimpse of the cabin. It looked even smaller in person than it had online, a modest wooden structure with a porch that sagged slightly on one side. The windows were dark and reflective, showing only fragments of the forest behind me. I parked on the uneven dirt beside it and took a deep breath. The silence was striking. Not the kind of silence where you can hear the wind or the birds, but the kind of silence that felt complete and suffocating. I unloaded my bag and started exploring the cabin. Inside, it smelled like damp wood and old pine. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung in corners like forgotten memories. There was a small fireplace, a kitchen corner with a tiny stove, and a single bed with a thin mattress. It wasn't much, but it would do. I decided I would spend the night there, then start exploring the forest in the morning. That thought gave me a strange comfort. I had imagined myself walking through the woods, breathing the fresh air, feeling like I was completely away from the world. I set up a small camp stove and made some instant coffee. The cabin's windows let in very little light, and by the time I finished drinking, the sun was already dipping below the treetops. Shadows stretched long and dark, and the wind picked up, rattling the loose boards of the cabin. I told myself it was just the wind, that I was imagining things. But when I went to check the windows, I realized the forest outside had changed somehow. The dark shapes between the trees didn't look like ordinary shadows anymore. I could swear I saw movement, just on the edge of my vision. I shook my head and went to bed, convincing myself I was being paranoid. Sleep didn't come easy. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and every snap of a branch outside made me startle. I kept imagining that someone, or something, was moving through the trees, watching me. By midnight, I was certain of it. I could hear something dragging itself across the forest floor, a slow, deliberate movement, like someone was pacing just out of sight. I stayed frozen under my blanket, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The sounds went on for hours. Every time I thought it had stopped, it would start again. I finally convinced myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, but the weight of fear in my chest made it hard to breathe. The next morning, I ventured outside to look around. The forest was dense, and the cabin was more isolated than I realized. The dirt road I had driven in on was barely visible through the overgrown brush. I spent some time exploring, taking photos, and marking the trail in case I needed to find my way back quickly. That afternoon, I decided to gather some firewood. The cabin had a small stack, but it wouldn't last long if I planned to stay more than a night or two. I ventured further than I had before, deeper into the forest, looking for fallen branches and dry logs. It was then that I first noticed the signs. Tracks, not deer tracks or raccoon tracks. These were larger, heavier, and oddly human-shaped. I froze, staring at the ground. They were recent. The soil hadn't dried yet. My stomach sank, and I began to feel a deep, gnawing dread. I didn't want to see more, so I walked quickly back to the cabin, my eyes scanning the woods constantly. By the time I reached the cabin, my hands were shaking. I told myself I had imagined it, that it was probably a fallen branch pressed into the mud, or a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew the tracks were real. That night, I double-checked the locks on the cabin door. There was only one main entrance and a single window on the side, both old and weak. I pushed the heavy furniture in front of the door and placed a few large rocks under the windowsill, thinking it would at least slow someone down if they tried to get in. I sat by the fireplace with a hatchet beside me, trying to convince myself that I was safe. But I wasn't. Outside, I could hear the movement again. This time, it wasn't slow or deliberate. It was faster, more chaotic, like something was circling the cabin. I wanted to tell myself it was an animal, but I knew better. The sounds were too controlled, too careful, too human. I spent that night awake, swinging the hatchet at shadows, listening to every crunch of leaves. Sleep came in fits of shallow, dreamless dozing, and every sound from the outside made me jump. I felt trapped, surrounded by the endless trees. When dawn came, I forced myself to leave the cabin. I walked down the dirt road, trying to retrace my path, but the overgrowth had already reclaimed the trail in places. Every snap of a twig made me spin around. I realized then that I had no idea how far I was from the nearest town or even the nearest road. I was completely alone, and someone or something had been in these woods long before I arrived. I spent the next day exploring cautiously, making mental notes of landmarks. Every now and then, I would catch glimpses of movement at the edge of my vision. Trees swayed when there was no wind. Branches cracked under weight that didn't seem human or animal. I avoided walking in open areas, sticking to narrow paths where I could see any movement in advance. By late afternoon, I found a small creek. The sound of running water calmed me slightly, and I refilled my water bottle. I considered leaving immediately, but the forest was denser than I expected, and the sun was already starting to fall. I had to make it back to the cabin before dark. That night was worse than the first. I had barricaded the cabin door as best I could, But the noises outside didn't stop. If anything, they had grown bolder. Branches scraped against the walls. Footsteps shifted around the perimeter. I could hear a faint breathing in the dark. I stayed pressed against the fireplace, hatchet ready, listening as time stretched endlessly. Hours passed. I don't know if I dozed or just imagined time moving. All I knew was that by the time the first light of dawn broke, I was completely exhausted, my nerves frayed to the point of shaking uncontrollably. When I finally stepped outside, I saw something that made me stop cold. The ground around the cabin had been disturbed. Footprints, larger than mine, circled the structure. They moved in patterns that didn't make sense, stopping and starting, crossing each other as if whoever or whatever had been here had been inspecting the cabin carefully. I felt a tight, icy fear coil around my chest. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a random intruder. This was someone who had been here before, someone who knew how to move quietly, how to watch, how to make you feel trapped. I knew I couldn't stay. I couldn't risk walking down the road with whatever had been circling the cabin outside. I spent the day preparing. I packed everything I could carry, dismantled part of the porch to use as a makeshift shield, and collected every rock I could find. I planned to leave under the cover of darkness, using the trees as cover. As night fell, I waited until I thought the noises outside had died down. Then I started my slow crawl through the forest. Every step was careful, deliberate. Every snap of a twig sent a jolt of fear through me. I kept low, moving through brush and undergrowth, avoiding open areas, listening constantly. Hours later, I stumbled onto a wider path. I could see the faint glow of a distant road through the trees. Relief surged through me, but it didn't last. I could hear footsteps again, faster now, following me. My heart hammered as I ran blindly through the undergrowth. Branches tore at my clothes, and I stumbled over roots, scraping my hands and knees. The footsteps stayed close, but I didn't look back. I forced myself to focus on the light ahead. Finally, I broke through the last line of trees and onto the road. Headlights of a passing car glared toward me, and I ran straight into them, waving my arms frantically. The driver slammed on the brakes, and I collapsed on the asphalt, panting and bleeding, shaking so violently I could barely speak. I got help, and soon after, the police were searching the area. When they checked the cabin, it was empty. No signs of anyone living there permanently, just the disturbed ground and the tracks. I never went back. Even now, I still dream about that cabin. I can still hear the footsteps in my dreams, circling, patient, waiting. I never went back, and I never will. Some places, I realized, aren't meant to be visited, no matter how tempting the silence or the isolation might seem. The forest can hide many things, and some of them are patient, waiting for the right person to wander too far, too alone. I learned the hard way that sometimes the scariest thing isn't a ghost or a legend. It's a person, patient and silent, watching you without ever revealing themselves. And sometimes, that fear doesn't leave you, no matter how far away you go. I never thought a weekend getaway could turn into one of the most frightening experiences of my life. But that was before I drove down the winding dirt road, far away from the city lights, toward a small cabin I had rented in the mountains. The plan had been simple: escape the noise, leave work behind, and spend 2 days hiking and reading in solitude. I had packed lightly with only the essentials: food, water, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, matches, and a heavy coat for the cold nights. The road was narrow, lined with towering pine trees that blocked out most of the sun, and the deeper I went, the more I realized how isolated the place really was. There were no other houses for miles, and cell service had disappeared almost immediately after I turned off the main highway. When I first arrived, the cabin looked exactly like it had in the pictures online. Small, wooden, and rustic, with a steep roof and a stone chimney. The front porch creaked under my weight as I stepped out of the car, and I could feel the chill in the air immediately. The forest around it was dense, with thick underbrush and twisted roots that made every step uncertain. The sense of isolation was tangible, pressing in from every direction. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy, with a wood stove in the corner, a a small kitchen area, and one bedroom with a heavy, old mattress. There were no locks on the windows, and the door had only a basic latch, but for some reason, that fact didn't bother me at first. I unpacked quickly and decided to take a short hike before it got dark. The first hour on the trail felt normal, even pleasant. The dirt path wound through the trees, and I could hear birds calling and the occasional rustle of something moving in the underbrush. I had seen a few squirrels darting up the trees and a deer standing quietly near a clearing, watching me before it disappeared. But as I walked further, I realized that I had left the trail markers behind. It had been easy to follow the path when I started, but the trail had become faint, almost non-existent in places, and the forest seemed to press in around me. My heartbeat sped up slightly, but I told myself it was nothing, just the excitement of being alone in the wilderness. I checked my watch. I had at least an hour before sunset, so I decided to turn back. That's when I noticed it. A set of footprints, deep and wide, pressed into the soft earth. At first, I thought they were animal tracks, but the shape was too human, too deliberate. They were fresh, the mud still slightly wet, and they led off the trail, deeper into the forest. A chill ran down my spine, and I turned to head back toward the cabin. But when I did, I realized the sun was already lower than I expected. Shadows stretched long between the trees, and the forest felt suddenly hostile, each branch and rock a potential threat. I started to pick up the pace, trying to retrace my steps, but the trail had vanished entirely. Every tree looked the same, every shadow seemed to move, and my sense of direction collapsed under the weight of panic. I remember that moment with terrifying clarity. The realization that I was completely lost, alone, and unprepared for whatever might be out there with me. The footprints continued beside me, faint but persistent. They didn't belong to a large animal, they were human, and they were following me. I kept telling myself I was imagining it, that my mind was playing tricks in the low light. But every time I stopped to listen, the sound of breaking twigs seemed to echo just a little too close, and I could swear the tracks shifted in ways that made no sense if they were just random. I ran blindly through the underbrush, over roots, through mud, until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they were on fire. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get back to the cabin. The sun dipped below the treeline, and darkness swallowed the forest around me. My flashlight was in my backpack, and I had to stop, struggling to catch my breath, my hands trembling as I dug through the straps and buckles. When I finally clicked it on, the beam was narrow, barely illuminating the path ahead. I caught glimpses of the footprints again, but they were gone when I looked directly at them. Fear made every sound louder. The rustle of leaves, the distant snap of a branch, the hoot of an owl that suddenly felt predatory. Eventually, I stumbled back to the cabin just as the last light disappeared. The door felt like it took forever to unlock with shaking hands. Inside, I bolted it and slid a chair against it for extra measure. My chest heaved, and I could feel sweat soaking my shirt, even in the cold air. I checked all the windows. Nothing. The cabin was silent except for the creaking wood and the occasional crackle from the stove I had lit earlier. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that I had just gotten lost, that the tracks were probably another hiker, or maybe even a deer that had been on two legs for a weird moment of balance. Rational thoughts didn't help much. The fear had already settled in, thick and unrelenting. Hours passed. I didn't sleep. Every small sound made me jump. I kept thinking I saw shadows moving outside the windows, and I could hear faint footsteps around the cabin, circling, moving, disappearing. My mind was on high alert, and I didn't want to go outside to check. The isolation had transformed the place from a peaceful retreat into a trap. I stayed near the stove, keeping the fire going, eating only a little food to keep my strength up. I considered calling for help, but the signal was gone, just as it had been when I first drove down the road. I was trapped. The next day, I had to act. I couldn't spend another night like the first. I packed my backpack carefully, taking only what I needed, and decided to leave the cabin and hike out along the main dirt road I had used to reach the cabin. I marked the door with rocks so I could find my way back if needed. I took a deep breath and stepped out. The forest looked calm in the morning light, but I knew better now. Every movement, every rustle of leaves, made me tense. I kept my flashlight in hand despite the sunlight, holding it like a weapon. My senses were sharp, my every nerve screaming to run. As I moved, I noticed more signs that someone or something had been near the cabin recently. Footprints in the mud around the cabin that weren't there yesterday. Small pieces of wood displaced near the windows. I realized with horror that someone had been watching me, probably all night, but I forced myself to focus on the road ahead. I followed the dirt path, keeping an eye on everything, moving quickly but carefully to avoid twisting an ankle on hidden roots or rocks. Hours passed. I kept the sound of my own steps steady, tried to regulate my breathing, and forced myself to ignore the occasional sound behind me. There was a point when I stopped, heart pounding, because I thought I heard someone calling my name. I froze. Nothing. No one. Just the wind in the trees. My nerves were shredded. I knew I had to keep moving. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the faint outline of a highway through the trees. My heart leapt. Civilization. Safety. When I reached the highway, I was exhausted, filthy, and shaking. I waved down the first car I saw, and the driver didn't hesitate to stop. I told them quickly that I had been lost in the forest, that I had been followed, and needed to get to the nearest town. They looked at me with concern and drove me to the first police station. I gave my statement, and they explained that the area around that cabin had a history of trespassing and theft, that the owner had reported people trying to break into cabins in the past. No one had been arrested yet. They told me to stay somewhere safe, and I never returned to that cabin. The experience left me changed. I still love the mountains, still enjoy solitude, but now I carry a deep respect for how quickly things can turn dangerous when you are alone, isolated, and unprepared. The memory of those footsteps in the dark, the fear that someone was watching me, following me, is something I will never forget. It was a stark reminder that danger doesn't always look like what you expect. Sometimes, it's just a human presence, patient, quiet, and persistent. I remember the drive out there clearly, even though it was supposed to be a routine trip. The road was narrow and winding, carved between dense clusters of pine trees and old, crumbling stone walls. The sun was setting, its light cutting through the trees in long, sharp streaks, and I kept glancing at the GPS, not trusting that the signal would hold. I had my backpack in the passenger seat, packed with food, water, and all the gear I thought I might need for a weekend alone in a cabin tucked deep into the forest. I had never been there before. I found the rental online. Small, isolated, and rustic. The listing was clear about it being off the grid, which had attracted me because I wanted to disconnect from the city noise, from the people, from everything that made life feel too fast and loud. The last few miles were rough. The paved road gave way to gravel, which then turned into a dirt path, covered with roots and stones. My car bounced and shuddered with every turn. I had to go slow, and even at 20 miles per hour, I felt the tires slipping on loose rocks. The GPS had started to lag, showing me a straight line that didn't match the road at all. I kept telling myself I could manage, that I had the maps downloaded. I knew it wasn't ideal, but I had prepared as best as I could. Still, I couldn't shake the small, nagging sense of unease. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked exactly like the pictures. A small, wooden structure with a slanted roof, weathered by time, with a thin trail of smoke rising faintly from the chimney. No neighbors in sight, just the trees stretching endlessly in every direction. I parked on a little clearing, my car sinking slightly into the soft ground, and unloaded my backpack. The air was heavy with the smell of pine needles, damp earth, and something faintly metallic I couldn't identify. It wasn't unpleasant, just sharp enough to make me pause for a moment. The cabin itself was quiet. I pushed the door open, expecting some creak or groan, but it gave way smoothly. Inside, the wood smelled old but clean, like it had been scrubbed down before the season started. There was a small living area with a stove, a tiny kitchen corner, a bed tucked into one side, and a loft above. I checked the windows. They were locked with thick latches. Everything looked fine. I unpacked slowly, arranging my things neatly on the shelves and counters. I wanted everything to feel normal, even though my gut kept tightening. By the time I had unpacked, the sun had disappeared completely. The forest around me was dark now, the silhouettes of the trees stark against the dim sky. I lit a lantern and carried it into the loft, setting my backpack down beside the bed. The wind had picked up outside, moving the branches with a rattling sound. For a moment, I stood there listening, feeling the cabin shiver slightly under the gusts. I made a small fire in the stove, listening to the crackle of the wood. The warmth was comforting, but it didn't reach the corners of the cabin in the same way. Shadows pooled in every angle, moving as the flames flickered. I had brought books, a notebook, a camera, some supplies for coffee, and a first aid kit. I kept telling myself I had everything I needed. I double-checked the locks on the door and the windows before lying down, trying to convince myself that nothing would go wrong. Night fell fully, and with it came silence. Not the quiet that feels soft, the one where the air itself seems heavy and listening. It was thick, almost tangible, pressing against the walls, against my chest. I lay awake for hours, listening to small things. The wind, the occasional snap of a branch, a bird settling somewhere in the distance. Every sound was amplified. My heart would jump whenever the floorboards creaked, though I was alone. I told myself it was just the cabin settling. Old wood does that. Then, something shifted. I had just drifted off when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. It was low, a dragging noise, soft at first but deliberate. Something scraping across the dirt outside, close to the cabin. I froze, my body rigid. The fire in the stove flickered, casting brief shadows on the walls. The sound stopped. Then it started again, closer this time. My rational mind wanted to say it was an animal, a raccoon, maybe a deer, but the sound was different, heavier, slower. Something deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight I had brought and crept to the door, pressing my eye to the small window. Nothing. The yard was empty, bathed in silver light from the moon peeking through the clouds. I held my breath, listening. The dragging started again to the side of the cabin, then around the back. My stomach tightened. I considered calling someone, but there was no signal. My phone was useless out here. I tried to convince myself to stay calm, to wait until morning. I leaned against the door, feeling the wood under my hands, thinking about the locks. I counted them. 1, 2, 3, all secure. I could hear the dragging for nearly 2 hours, starting and stopping, as though whatever it was testing the cabin, walking its perimeter. Eventually, it faded into the distance. I lay back down, rigid, waiting for another sound, but the forest returned to silence. Sleep came in fits, my dreams filled with the sound of dragging and heavy steps. The next day, I forced myself to get up and assess. I looked around the cabin, inspecting the ground. There were marks, scrapes in the dirt, lines that weren't made by the wind or falling branches. They led from the tree line to the cabin and back. I took pictures and circled them carefully, trying to understand what had happened. Nothing was taken. Nothing inside the cabin was disturbed, but the marks outside were deep, heavy, like claws or metal. Whatever it was had weight. I spent the day fixing small things in the cabin, trying to normalize the space, but the feeling never left me. The forest seemed too quiet now, every sound unnatural, amplified. By the second night, I realized I hadn't eaten properly, hadn't slept more than a few hours. My body tense, muscles locked. The dragging started again, just as it had the night before, and I knew I couldn't stay passive. I had to do something if I wanted to survive the weekend I had planned. I packed everything I might need. Flashlight, a knife from the kitchen, my backpack, water, and extra clothing. I waited until the first signs of light and started hiking down the dirt path that had brought me here. The path looked different in daylight. I could see the marks from the night. The dirt scuffed in ways that made me certain something had been out there. The forest felt alive, observing me. Every rustle made me stop, scanning the trees. I kept moving, trying not to panic, but my mind replayed the sounds from the night, and I kept imagining shapes moving just out of sight. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, and I eventually reached the end of the trail where it met the gravel road. My hands were raw, my legs aching. I kept glancing back at the dense treeline, knowing that if anything had followed me, it would have shown itself by now. I got back to the paved road and flagged down a car, explaining as best I could to the driver that I needed to get out, without revealing the paranoia I feared they would laugh at. When I finally reached my apartment in the city, I slept for more than a day straight. I didn't check my phone. I didn't want the news. I unpacked slowly, every item a reminder of the weekend I had survived. I never returned to the cabin. Couldn't. Even months later, I would dream about that scraping noise, the heavy steps circling the cabin, and the empty yard that had somehow felt alive with menace. The experience left me with a permanent caution about isolation, about trusting silence, and about how thin the line is between solitude and exposure. I know now that the forest is not inherently dangerous. It's just indifferent. The danger comes from what can exist quietly, waiting, just beyond sight, testing your boundaries without reason or explanation. And the cabin, with its weathered walls and secure locks, was not protection enough. I survived, but only because I acted, because I recognized that the quiet was not comfort. It was observation. And I carry that memory with me every time I enter a quiet space, every time I hear an unexpected noise. Ding it to reach that extreme length in one full go. I drove for hours along the twisting forest roads, the kind of roads that seem to go on forever and disappear into dense stands of pine and fir. The air was thick with the scent of wet soil and fallen leaves, the kind that clings to your clothes even after hours inside. I had rented the cabin for a week, hoping for solitude, time to think, and a break from the constant noise of the city. The GPS showed that I was close, but the road had narrowed into a rough dirt track, rutted with water from recent rain. I had to slow to a crawl, gripping the steering wheel tightly as the car bounced over hidden rocks and roots. The cabin came into view suddenly. It was small, old, built of weathered logs that had turned a deep brown with age. Moss covered portions of the roof, and the windows were thick with grime. Despite its rundown appearance, there was a charm to it, a quiet sense of isolation. I parked on the small clearing in front of the cabin, listening as the forest swallowed the sound of my car's engine. For a moment, the only noise was the wind in the trees and the occasional rustle of something moving in the underbrush. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and dust. There were cobwebs in the corners, thick layers of dust on the shelves, and the fireplace looked like it hadn't been used in years. I spent the first hour just exploring. The cabin had a small kitchen, a single bedroom, a bathroom with an old tub, and a living area with a worn sofa and a few chairs. The windows looked out onto the dense forest, tall trees standing like silent guards. I unpacked my bag, lit a small lamp, and tried to get comfortable. The forest outside felt so close that I could almost imagine stepping out and being swallowed by it entirely. It was beautiful, in a quiet, unsettling way. The first night was difficult. The sounds of the forest seemed louder at night, the branches scratching against the cabin walls, the occasional thump of something falling far off, the steady hum of insects. I could hear what I thought were small animals moving around the cabin, sometimes close enough to make the floorboards creak. I tried to focus on reading a book, telling myself it was normal, just wildlife. I eventually fell asleep, though every sound made me jolt awake, my heart thudding in the quiet. The next day, I went for a walk along a faint trail I had noticed while arriving. It wound through thick underbrush, the path almost hidden under fallen leaves and debris. Birds called from high above, and once in a while I spotted squirrels or deer darting away. I was careful, staying aware of my surroundings, but after a few hours I noticed I had gone further than I expected. The trail looped and twisted, and I began to recognize less of the forest. Everything looked the same: dense trees, thick undergrowth, the occasional glimpse of a distant hill. I decided to turn back, but when I did, I realized the trail behind me seemed different. Branches that hadn't been there before now blocked the path, and a tangle of vines seemed to rise out of nowhere. I took a few deep breaths, trying not to panic, and pushed through. Eventually, I found the trail I had come from, but the sense of unease lingered. By the third night, things felt off in the cabin. I noticed small disturbances. The firewood I had stacked neatly near the fireplace was slightly moved. The kitchen window latch that I had locked was undone, and one of the chairs had been shifted slightly from where I had left it. I told myself it was wind or small animals, that I was just imagining things. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted. I started keeping a flashlight and a heavy stick near the bed, just in case. Around midnight, I was woken by a sound that made my stomach drop. It was a slow, deliberate knocking, soft at first, then louder, coming from the back of the cabin. I froze, straining my ears, listening as the knocks stopped. My first instinct was to convince myself it was a branch hitting the wall, but the sound had been too precise, too measured. I stayed still for what felt like an eternity, heart pounding, until I finally mustered the courage to grab the flashlight and check. The beam lit the small kitchen, the back door, the windows. Everything seemed normal. Nothing moved. I checked the perimeter of the cabin with the flashlight, circling slowly, and found nothing. Still, the feeling of eyes on me lingered. Sleep came fitfully, and every creak of the old wood made me jump. The next day, I noticed something disturbing. Footprints. Clear, wet footprints in the mud outside, leading up to the cabin and stopping at the door. I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard anyone come near. The prints were heavy, deep, and they didn't match my boots. I spent hours examining them, trying to figure out if some animal could have made them, but the size and shape were unmistakable. Someone had been at the cabin. I checked all the windows and doors. Nothing had been broken. Nothing seemed disturbed beyond the minor things I had noticed before. I couldn't explain it, and the thought of someone being here while I slept made me feel exposed, vulnerable. Over the next few days, the feeling worsened. Small things began to disappear and reappear. A cooking pot moved from the stove to the table. A pair of gloves left on a chair were gone, and then back in a different spot. I made sure to lock every door and window, but the unease only grew. On the fourth night, I decided to sleep fully clothed, with the flashlight within reach and the stick under the bed. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow darker. At around 2 a.m., I heard it again, a soft, deliberate scraping sound coming from the side of the cabin, near the kitchen window. My heart raced. I grabbed the stick and flashlight, moving slowly toward the sound. The beam caught nothing. I pressed my ear to the floor, listening, and could hear faint breathing, shallow and deliberate. Outside, the forest was still, the trees holding their secrets. I stepped back, trying to calm myself, telling myself I must be imagining it, but deep down, I knew someone had been watching me. The breaking point came on the 5th day. I had decided to leave the cabin early and drive back to civilization. I packed quickly, ignoring the forest around me, feeling only a sense of urgency to be away. As I stepped out to the car, I froze. Near the side of the cabin, someone had dug a shallow hole in the mud. Inside it were small items of mine, scraps of paper from my notebook, a spoon, a candle. Someone had been inside while I was sleeping, observing me, taking things. Panic surged. I checked the perimeter again, this time calling out, but no answer came, just the echo of my voice. The forest swallowed it instantly. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the car with the doors locked, flashlight ready, scanning the trees. Hours passed. The wind moved through the branches, and I thought I saw fleeting shapes in the darkness, but they disappeared when I focused. Finally, as dawn broke, I gathered courage and drove slowly down the dirt track. Every shadow felt like it was watching. Every rustle in the underbrush made my stomach tighten. I called the local sheriff as soon as I was on a signal road, reporting the situation, the footprints, and the disturbed items. They didn't laugh or dismiss me. They took it seriously, warning that the area sometimes attracted people who sought isolated places for illicit activity. They advised me not to return to the cabin alone and promised to send someone to inspect it. I returned weeks later, accompanied by 2 deputies. They searched thoroughly. The floorboards under the bedroom and kitchen were slightly raised, revealing a small, hidden crawl space. Inside were remnants of a camp, old food wrappers, a tattered blanket, and a few of my missing items. It appeared someone had been living there intermittently, hiding from authorities. The deputies confirmed it was a local squatter known for breaking into isolated cabins. They had left when they realized I was staying there, but the psychological impact of knowing I had been watched and that someone had entered while I slept stayed with me. Eventually, the cabin was cleaned and secured properly. I never stayed there again, but the experience remained vivid in my mind. The oppressive quiet, the feeling of eyes watching, the footprints in the mud. It was a stark reminder of how alone one can feel in a place that seems safe, and how quickly isolation can turn into a nightmare when someone has been lurking where you least expect it. I still remember the smell of wet wood, the sound of branches scraping against the cabin, and the terror of realizing someone had been inside without my knowledge. It changed the way I thought about solitude, the forest, and the sense of security I had always taken for granted. I had been looking forward to the cabin trip for months. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, away from the city noise, the endless emails, the constant movement. I had found this small cabin online, tucked deep into a forested area several hours from the nearest town. The pictures were simple but appealing. A rustic wooden structure with a stone fireplace, a small porch and windows that looked out onto a dense patch of pine and oak trees. There was no electricity listed, just a wood stove and a nearby stream. I liked that. I liked the idea of leaving behind everything for a while. I arrived late on a Friday afternoon, the sun low in the sky and casting long shadows across the gravel driveway leading to the cabin. The forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of birds and the distant sound of a stream. The air smelled crisp, a mix of pine, wet earth, and the faint decay of fallen leaves. Parking the car beside the cabin, I grabbed my backpack and my small duffel bag and walked toward the front door. The cabin was smaller than I imagined. Inside, the space was simple and practical. A living area with a worn sofa and an armchair, a small dining table, a kitchen with a few cabinets, and the wood stove. To the side was a narrow hallway leading to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. Everything was clean but clearly used. Small scratches on the floor, minor dents in the walls, faint stains on the carpet. I unpacked my things quickly, placing my clothes in the drawers and setting up my backpack by the bed. By the time I had finished, the sun was gone, leaving the forest outside in a dim, bluish twilight. I lit a few candles and started a fire in the wood stove. The warmth quickly filled the room, and the soft light made the cabin feel comfortable. I made a simple dinner from canned beans and bread, and while eating, I stared out the window at the darkening forest. The shadows between the trees were deepening, and I noticed how quickly the sounds of birds and small animals had faded. Soon, only the rustling of leaves in the wind remained. It was my first night, and I went to bed feeling tired but content. The bed was small and firm, the blankets thin but sufficient. I fell asleep listening to the occasional snap of a branch outside, not thinking much of it. Then I woke up. I wasn't sure what had woken me at first. It wasn't a sound, at least not clearly. It was more like a feeling, a weight pressing down, making it hard to breathe. I opened my eyes, and it took a moment to adjust to the darkness. The only light came from the faint moon shining through the window. That's when I noticed movement. Something was outside. Just beyond the edge of the porch, a shadow shifted. My heart began to race. I froze, trying to convince myself it was nothing. An animal, maybe, moving through the trees, but the shape seemed deliberate. It didn't dart away like a deer or a raccoon. It stayed just at the edge of the clearing, watching. I wanted to move, to grab something for protection, but my body refused. I lay there, every nerve screaming. Eventually, I managed to push myself up and tiptoe to the window. I pressed my face to the glass, trying to make out details. The figure was tall, hunched slightly, and moved slowly. It didn't run or dash away. It simply stayed there, shifting slightly from side to side, as if scanning the cabin. The rational part of my mind told me it could be a hiker or someone lost, but that didn't make the fear any less real. I backed away from the window and grabbed a kitchen knife, holding it tightly. My pulse was loud in my ears. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every sound made me flinch. The wind rattling the trees, a branch snapping in the distance, the creak of the cabin settling. I stayed in the corner of the living room, knife in hand, staring at the dark window. By morning, exhaustion had taken over, but my fear didn't leave. The next day, I tried to rationalize. I told myself it was probably a hunter, someone wandering the forest, maybe curious about the cabin. I decided to spend the day outside, collecting firewood and exploring the area, thinking that activity would distract me. The forest was beautiful during the day. Sunlight streamed through the branches, and I walked along a narrow path leading down to the stream. The water was clear and cold, and I washed my face and drank directly from it. For a while, the tension in my chest eased. But as the day went on, I started noticing signs. Footprints in the dirt near the cabin that weren't mine. Twigs broken in patterns that didn't look natural. I had made a small path to collect wood, and when I returned, I saw that someone or something had walked along it. The prints were human. I spent the rest of the day on edge, checking every corner, every window, even inspecting the locks on the door. By evening, I had barricaded the door with a chair and set a few candles along the windows so I could see outside. I cooked another simple meal, but my appetite was gone. Every sound made me freeze. Every shadow made me turn my head. That night was worse than the first. The figure returned, or maybe it had never left. I could see movement outside, slow and deliberate. Sometimes I caught a glimpse of a face, or at least what looked like a face, in the dim moonlight. I stayed crouched behind the sofa, trying not to breathe too loudly, listening. The wind carried faint noises, footsteps crunching on leaves, the sound of something being dragged. By early morning, I realized that hiding wasn't enough. I had to act. I packed my bag quickly, taking only essentials, clothes, food, water, the knife. I left the cabin, staying low and moving quickly through the trees toward the gravel driveway. When I reached the car, I noticed tire tracks in the dirt, fresh and leading toward the cabin. Someone had been watching me, following me. I started the car and drove slowly at first, scanning the tree line, but saw no one. Once I felt the immediate area was clear, I floored the gas pedal and drove toward the nearest town, every second filled with tension. My hands were shaking, and my mind was racing with questions. Why me? Why that cabin? How long had they been there? I didn't look back until I reached the safety of the main road. The following days were a blur. I reported the incident to the police, who promised to send someone to check the cabin. When they went, they found signs of repeated visits. Footprints, small items left behind, a sense that someone had been monitoring the cabin for weeks. There was no one there when they arrived, and the police couldn't find any suspects. I never went back to the cabin. I avoided the forest for months. Even walking near any wooded area felt threatening. But eventually, the fear dulled, replaced by a cautious awareness. I learned to trust my instincts, to pay attention to signs that something isn't right. I never found out who had been watching me that weekend, but I realized that fear isn't always about what you can see. It's about what's possible. The human mind can recognize danger even when it isn't clear, even when it isn't tangible. Years later, I returned to the area, cautiously, and drove past the gravel road that led to the cabin. The structure was still there, quiet and unassuming, blending with the trees. Part of me wanted to see it up close again, to confront the memory, but I kept driving. The forest seemed harmless now, just a place of trees and wind, but I never forgot the feeling of being watched, the cold realization that someone could be observing you without ever revealing themselves. That weekend had changed me. It had made me more careful, more aware, and it had reminded me that even the quietest places can hold real danger. I had been planning this solo cabin trip for months, and finally, in early October, I had the chance to get away from the city. The air in the apartment that morning felt heavy, the usual hum of traffic outside muted in my mind by stress I couldn't shake. I needed silence. I needed isolation. I needed to be somewhere where I couldn't hear the constant buzzing of life pressing on me. I packed my backpack carefully, checking every item twice, making sure I had food for a week, extra water, a first aid kit, all the tools I thought I might need, and enough firewood to last for the first few nights. I didn't want to rely on anything except what I could carry and what the cabin provided. The drive was long and winding. As I left the outskirts of the city, the streets narrowed, lined with trees whose leaves were just beginning to turn yellow and orange. By the time I reached the forest roads, the pavement gave way to rough gravel, and then to dirt tracks that twisted into thick stands of pines and oaks. My phone reception had already disappeared miles back, and I knew from maps that I wouldn't see it again until I left the forest. The solitude should have been calming, but as the car bounced along the dirt road, a small knot of unease formed in my stomach. The further I drove, the quieter everything became. No birds, no wind in the trees, just the crunch of tires on gravel and the occasional distant snap of a branch. Finally, after almost 3 hours of driving from the highway, I reached the cabin. It was smaller than I had imagined from the online listing, a single-story log structure with a small porch and a chimney. The wood was weathered grayish-brown, the roof showing patches where the sun had bleached it unevenly. The forest pressed right up to the walls of the cabin, and the nearest neighbor, according to the map, was almost a mile away. I parked and stepped out, stretching my stiff legs. The air was crisp, almost biting against my skin. I inhaled deeply and felt a brief surge of relief. This was exactly what I had come for. I spent the first hour inspecting the cabin, checking the locks, the windows, the foundation. The inside smelled faintly of old wood and must, but it was clean. A small kitchen, a lofted bedroom, a fireplace, and a single bathroom. The furniture was minimal. A small table, a couple of chairs, a bed with thin linens. Perfect. I unloaded my car, stacked my supplies on the table, and started a fire in the fireplace. The flames crackled, and for a moment I felt safe. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the fire, I realized just how quiet it was. No wind, no animals, no distant sounds of humans. It was absolute stillness, the kind that makes a person hyper-aware of every little creak or rustle. I tried to sleep but kept hearing the subtle noises of the cabin itself settling. I chalked it up to the old wood expanding and contracting. I eventually drifted off, exhausted. The next morning I woke early. The sunlight barely touched the cabin, filtered through the thick forest. I prepared a small breakfast and stepped outside, taking in the view. There was a narrow trail leading deeper into the woods, and I decided to explore for a few hours. The air was damp, the ground soft and muddy from recent rains. I followed the trail until it forked several times, each turn looking more unfamiliar than the last. I marked some of the trees with small scratches of my knife so I could find my way back. By mid-afternoon, I realized I had walked farther than I planned. The woods felt different here. The trees were denser, the undergrowth thicker, and the occasional sound of wildlife, birds calling, a squirrel rustling, was absent. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something moving behind me, just outside my line of sight. When I stopped and listened, there was nothing. I told myself it was my imagination. I reminded myself that I was alone, and that was always enough to make your brain play tricks. Eventually, I turned back, following my scratches. But as I moved, I realized I had somehow lost my markings. Either the scratches were faint, or the forest had shifted in my mind, making them impossible to track. My pace quickened. Shadows between the trees seemed longer, darker. Each step on the muddy ground felt amplified, echoing in the silence. I kept my eyes ahead, telling myself the cabin couldn't be far. But the more I walked, the more the trail seemed to disappear. Panic started to set in. The sun was dropping, the forest growing darker. My sense of direction failed me completely. Every tree looked like the one before. Every path looked like a dead end. I remembered my phone, no signal. I had no map, no compass. Just me and the forest. I kept moving, hoping instinctively that I would eventually find the dirt road or the cabin. As twilight fell, I stumbled upon a small clearing. At first, I thought I had found a path, but there was nothing. Just trees surrounding me on all sides. The air had grown colder, dampness clinging to my clothes. I realized I hadn't eaten much since morning and was dehydrated. My backpack was heavy, my legs sore. I had no choice but to keep moving. Then I saw it. A figure. At first, I thought it was another hiker. My heart raced. The figure was standing very still, partially hidden by the trees. I froze, unsure if I should approach or retreat. As I focused, I realized it wasn't human. It was an old, rusted sign, leaning at an odd angle, covered in moss and difficult to see in the fading light. My pulse slowed slightly, but my body was still tense. I realized how easy it would have been to misinterpret shapes in this kind of darkness. Night came quickly, faster than I expected in the forest. I had to find the cabin before it was completely dark. I kept moving almost blindly, trying to recall landmarks from my morning walk. Eventually, I recognized a familiar stand of pines. Relief surged. I ran. The ground was uneven, and I tripped several times, scraping my hands and knees. Finally, I saw the outline of the cabin. I sprinted the last few yards, throwing open the door and collapsing inside. I was covered in mud, scratches, and soaked in sweat, but I was safe. I spent the rest of the night by the fire, shaking but slowly recovering. I realized how easily I could have gotten lost forever. Every noise outside made me jump. The wind, the branches, even the distant howl of a coyote. But I stayed inside, telling myself that nothing could reach me here. By morning, I felt a little more in control, more aware of the cabin's boundaries and the forest's edges. The next few days, I adjusted. I marked the trail with bright pieces of cloth and large sticks. I mapped small sections in my mind and even began to enjoy the solitude. The cabin became a base, a small island of safety in the vast wilderness. I explored carefully, never straying too far, always aware of how quickly the forest could disorient a person. On the fourth day, I woke early to see frost covering the ground. The air was crisp, each breath visible in the cold morning light. I decided to check the woodpile. The cabin had a small shed nearby where extra firewood was kept. I stepped outside and noticed something unusual. One of the stacked logs had shifted. Not a minor shift, but completely out of alignment, almost like it had been pulled away and replaced. My heart skipped a beat. I had been careful to secure everything the day before. No wind, no animals I could see. I felt a shiver run down my spine. My mind raced through possibilities. Perhaps an animal had moved it, raccoons, deer, something strong enough to move the log? That seemed unlikely, but not impossible. I adjusted the log back into place, glancing around. The forest was quiet, the usual distant sounds absent. I tried to shake it off, attributing it to overactive nerves. That night, I kept the cabin locked more securely than before. I double-checked the windows, stacked heavy furniture near the doors. Every sound made me tense. A branch snapped outside, and I jumped, heart pounding. But I stayed awake, watching the fire flicker, reminding myself that I was prepared, and that nothing outside could threaten me in the cabin. By the sixth day, I was more comfortable but still alert. I spent most of my time reading, cleaning, organizing supplies. I cooked small meals on the wood stove and collected water from a nearby stream. The forest, while still imposing, had become less threatening because I had taken control of my immediate environment. I had learned its rhythms, its subtle warnings. I respected it, but I no longer feared it in the same way. On the seventh day, I decided to explore further, carefully marking the trail. I walked slowly, noting every rock, tree, and bend. For hours, I navigated through narrow paths, eventually coming to a small creek. The water was clear, and I drank cautiously, savoring the cold, fresh taste. As I rested on a rock, I noticed footprints in the mud. Human footprints. They were fresh too. I froze, examining them. They weren't my own. Whoever had been here had come from the deeper forest and hadn't gone back the way I came. Panic rose again, but I forced myself to stay calm. I retraced my steps carefully, staying aware of the surroundings, until I reached a point where I could see the top of the cabin through the trees. Relief washed over me. The presence of another person had reminded me of how isolated I was, how quickly things could go wrong. The final night, I slept with the fire low but steady, confident in my preparations. I knew I had survived the isolation, the fear, and the mistakes I had made. I realized that the cabin itself was safe. It was the forest outside that demanded respect and caution. By morning, I packed carefully, leaving the cabin as I had found it. The drive back through the forest was quiet, but I felt different. Not exhausted, not terrified, but alert, alive, and aware of the thin line between control and vulnerability. The city lights were overwhelming after days in the forest. I drove slowly, savoring the return, knowing that I had faced real fear and I had come out intact. Even now, when I think back, I remember the silence most vividly. That absolute, pressing silence of the forest that can make a person doubt their own senses. I remember the feeling of being small, alone, and exposed, and the relief that comes from taking control. It was scary, yes, but I had survived. And that survival, that clarity, that understanding of my limits and my preparedness, that was worth everything. The first time I saw the cabin, it looked exactly how I imagined a remote getaway in the mountains should look. It was small, wooden, weathered by years of harsh snow and sun, tucked into a shallow clearing surrounded by towering pines and birches. The driveway was little more than a dirt path, narrow and overgrown, leading from the main road several miles back. My car crunched along the uneven stones as I drove closer, the engine struggling a bit with the incline. It was late afternoon, and the sun had just started to lean behind the jagged peaks ahead, casting long shadows across the valley. I had packed lightly, only bringing a backpack, some canned food, bottled water, and a few warm layers. The plan was simple. A week alone, hiking, reading, and just getting away from the constant noise of the city. Nothing complicated, nothing dangerous, or so I thought. As I approached the cabin, the first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't just that there were no cars or people. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your ears, a total absence of sound except for the faint wind in the trees. My footsteps on the dirt and stones felt loud, echoing in the empty space around me. I parked my car to the side of the cabin, a little further than I intended because the incline was steep and uneven. I left the engine running a moment longer, just sitting there, listening. The wind moved the branches, brushing them against each other in a low, creaking rhythm. It sounded like the forest itself was breathing, slow and heavy. The cabin door was stiff, but it opened. Inside, the smell of damp would hit me first, a musty, earthy smell that made me cough slightly. Dust motes floated in the shafts of sunlight coming through the small, grimy windows. The interior was simple. There was a small kitchen area with a wood-burning stove, a table with 2 chairs, a narrow couch that sagged in the middle, and a small bookshelf with a handful of old books. The floor was wooden and uneven, and some of the boards creaked when I walked. There was a loft area above the main room, accessible by a narrow wooden ladder. That was where I planned to sleep. I unpacked slowly, setting my bag down on the floor, checking the stove to see if it worked. It did, though the chimney needed cleaning, and making sure the windows and door locked properly. Everything seemed intact, and for a moment I felt completely safe. Alone, yes, but safe. The first night was quiet, almost painfully so. I made a small fire in the stove and sat on the couch, eating canned beans straight from the tin. The shadows from the fire danced across the walls, making the cabin feel warmer than it really was. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and bending the trees. I could hear branches snapping occasionally, and the distant call of a bird or animal, but nothing more. When I went up to the loft, I slept deeply, or at least I thought I did. I woke a few times, half dreaming that someone was standing at the doorway, but each time I opened my eyes, it was empty. By morning, I laughed at myself, convinced my imagination was just adjusting to the isolation. The next few days were uneventful, almost monotonous in a comforting way. I hiked down the trail in the mornings, taking pictures of the landscape, sometimes venturing further than I probably should have. The forest was dense, with only narrow trails cutting through the undergrowth. The air was crisp, filled with pine and damp earth. I watched squirrels dart through the trees, saw deer grazing in the meadows, and occasionally caught glimpses of smaller animals scurrying away as I passed. Back at the cabin, I cooked simple meals, chopped wood for the stove, and read from the books on the shelf. The isolation was peaceful, and I enjoyed the simplicity of it. It was on the fourth night that I first felt the sense of being watched. I didn't see anything at first. There was no movement outside the windows, but the feeling was undeniable. I had been sitting on the couch, my fire burning low, reading a book on local flora when the hair on my arms stood up. It was subtle at first, a prickling at the back of my neck, a small tightening in my chest. Then I noticed the faintest sound. Outside, near the treeline, something shifted. A branch bent sharply, then straightened again. The kind of sound you barely notice in the city, but here it was amplified, piercing. I froze, listening. Nothing moved for a moment. I reminded myself it was probably an animal, a deer, a raccoon, something small. Still, I made sure the door was locked, bolted it with the old latch, and sat with the fire close to me, my back to the wall. Hours passed, and I tried to convince myself it was nothing. But every now and then, I heard small noises, scratches at the windows, branches snapping closer than they should have been. I checked the loft before bed, looking down at the cabin floor to make sure everything was where I had left it. Nothing was out of place. I slept fitfully, dreams filled with shadows moving just out of reach. When morning came, the sense of unease had not gone. In fact, it had intensified slightly. I told myself it was the isolation, that my body and mind were adjusting to being alone for days at a time. That morning, I decided to explore further down the valley. The trail was overgrown and steep, but I was careful, noting landmarks and keeping track of time. Hours into the hike, I stumbled across something that made my stomach twist. A campsite, abandoned, with a tattered tent and a small, rusted cooking stove. The area was clearly used recently. There were footprints in the dirt, smoldering ashes from a fire not fully cold. The idea that someone had been here, possibly watching the cabin, hit me like a punch. I left quickly, taking care to avoid leaving my own tracks or signs that I had been there. Back at the cabin, I checked the locks on the doors and windows multiple times. My fire that night burned high, and I kept a hatchet within reach on the floor by the couch. Over the next day, my unease grew into something heavier. I noticed subtle signs outside, broken twigs along the path leading to the cabin, footprints that weren't mine, sometimes shallow depressions in the grass near the cabin that hadn't been there before. I didn't see anyone, but the evidence was clear. I realized I wasn't completely alone, and that someone, or something, had been following me. The logical side of my brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a hiker, maybe a hunter, maybe someone else staying in the woods. But the longer I stayed, the more obvious it became that whoever it was, they knew the cabin, knew me, or had been watching the area closely. The fifth night, it became impossible to ignore. I had been sitting in the loft, keeping the fire low, listening to the wind and occasional sounds outside. Around midnight, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on the dirt path leading to the cabin. Slow, deliberate, careful, but heavy enough that each step was clear. My heart raced, and I stayed absolutely still, straining to hear. The steps moved toward the front door and stopped. Long silence. Then I heard it. A soft scraping like metal against wood. Someone had tried the door latch. My stomach dropped. I grabbed the hatchet and crouched by the ladder, ready for whatever came next. I could hear breathing outside, slow and deliberate. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of smoke and something metallic, perhaps from the person themselves. My mind raced through scenarios, what to do, how to protect myself, how to get out. Hours seemed to stretch endlessly. The figure didn't leave. I stayed crouched, listening, waiting for a sound that might give me an opening. I tried to control my breathing, but it was impossible. The minutes felt like hours. Eventually, the sound stopped, but I couldn't be sure if they had left or were simply hiding. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I had decided that staying put was no longer safe. The next day, I packed quickly, taking only essentials. I had scoped the area during the day, noting the most direct route back to the main road. I moved cautiously, checking the surrounding forest constantly. As I descended the trail, I found more evidence. Footprints that hadn't been there before, small items I didn't recognize, maybe left as markers or warnings. My heart pounded with every step. It wasn't fear of the forest or animals anymore. This was human. Someone was watching, tracking, and possibly waiting for me to make a mistake. Hours later, I reached the main road. A car passed by and I flagged it down, explaining as best as I could that I had been in danger. The driver didn't ask many questions, just offered a ride to the nearest town. Once I was on paved roads and surrounded by people, I felt my tension begin to ease, though my hands were still trembling. I called the local authorities from the town, reporting the cabin, the footprints, the broken latch attempts. They took notes but didn't say much beyond the standard warnings about remote cabins and hikers. I didn't go back to that area for years. Even now, thinking back, the memory of that cabin, the silence, the sounds, the waiting, stays with me. The isolation, the sense of being observed, the simple act of leaving became a matter of survival. The experience left me with a clearer understanding of what being alone really means, how careful one must be in the wilderness, and how quickly a quiet retreat can turn into something dangerous. I learned the value of preparation, observation, and caution. The cabin itself was just a building, the forest just a forest, but the human element, someone watching, someone tracking, was what made it terrifying. When I finally look back at the photos I took, the beauty of the place almost blinds me, but beneath it lies a layer of tension and awareness I'll never forget. That week, I understood isolation in a way I never had before, and when I returned to civilization, I felt a strange relief, a sense of having survived more than just solitude. I had been driving for hours through winding mountain roads that I barely recognized from the map. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, and the only light left came from the occasional streak of moon cutting through the gaps in the dense forest. I had planned this trip months in advance, thinking it would be a peaceful escape from the chaos of city life. A small, secluded cabin deep in the woods promised the quiet and solitude I craved. But as I drove further into the darkness, a creeping sense of unease settled over me, a feeling I tried to shake off with rational thoughts. It was late, the roads were empty, and the forest always looked intimidating at night. The cabin wasn't far off the road according to the directions I had printed out, but the path leading to it had long since turned into a rough dirt track. Branches scratched against the sides of my car, and I had to maneuver carefully over deep ruts and loose stones. I remembered reading about people who got stuck in isolated areas during storms, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. The further I drove, the more I realized that I had no phone signal. The thought should have been alarming, but I pushed it aside. I told myself I was prepared. I had packed extra water, food, and a first aid kit, and the cabin was meant to be stocked with firewood and basic supplies. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of driving, I saw it. The cabin was small, made of weathered wood, with a sloped roof and a single stone chimney. It looked exactly like the pictures I had seen online, except in the dim moonlight, it seemed far lonelier, almost swallowed by the towering trees around it. I parked the car beside it, cut the engine, and listened. The forest was alive with the sounds of night, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, the distant howl of a coyote. Nothing immediately alarming, just the natural sounds of the woods, but in that still, isolated moment they seemed amplified. I grabbed my backpack and stepped toward the cabin. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a small, dark interior. Dust hung in the air, disturbed only by the movement of my footsteps. The cabin smelled of old wood, damp earth, and something faintly metallic that I couldn't place. I switched on my flashlight and began inspecting the place. There was a small kitchen area with a rusty sink, a worn table, and a few chairs. The stove looked functional, though I didn't feel confident using it until I inspected it properly. A stone fireplace dominated one corner of the room, and I felt a momentary relief at the thought of lighting a fire for warmth. Upstairs, the cabin had two small bedrooms. One had a bed with a thin mattress and old blankets folded neatly at the foot, and the other appeared more like a storage room, filled with boxes, old furniture, and a few tools. I set my backpack down on the bed and took a deep breath. Despite the isolation, the cabin felt safe, at least superficially. I decided to start a fire, thinking it would help me relax and provide light. The fireplace was lined with a pile of wood, though it was damp from previous rain. I used the dry kindling I had brought and managed to get a small flame going. The fire crackled and warmed the room, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I felt a little more at ease, but a part of me remained on edge. Hours passed. I ate a simple meal I had packed, and as the night deepened, I could hear the forest in full swing outside. Every noise seemed louder than it should have been. The rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional heavy branch falling to the ground. I tried to focus on mundane tasks, checking the supplies, organizing my things, reading an old notebook I had brought, but a growing tension persisted. It wasn't until late at night that I first sensed it, the feeling of being watched. I can't say why exactly, perhaps a misalignment of shadows, perhaps my imagination fueled by the darkness. I froze in the living room, flashlight in hand, straining my ears. The fire crackled normally, the wind outside was gentle, and yet there it was, the persistent, creeping sensation that someone or something was outside the cabin, waiting. I told myself it was impossible. The nearest road was miles away. No one could have known I was here. Then I heard it, a faint, deliberate sound on the porch, a slow, methodical tapping, like someone testing the door or window. My heart leapt into my throat. I held my breath and moved closer to the door, peering out the small window. Nothing. The trees swayed gently in the wind, shadows moving in a way that almost resembled figures, but nothing concrete. I backed away, telling myself it was probably a branch or some small animal, though my stomach twisted with unease. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the fire, every sound amplified, every shadow suspicious. Sleep did not come. At some point, the tapping returned, more insistent, almost as if someone was circling the cabin. I didn't dare step outside, didn't dare even look too closely. Instead, I sat rigidly, clutching a heavy metal flashlight like a weapon. I kept reminding myself it was likely nothing, a rational explanation waiting to be discovered in daylight. Morning came slowly. The sky was overcast, muted gray filtering through the trees. I left the cabin only after a shaky breakfast, determined to investigate the surroundings in daylight. What I saw made my blood run cold. Around the perimeter of the cabin, footprints were visible in the damp soil, large, heavy, and unmistakably human. They had circled the cabin several times, coming close to the windows, stopping and turning back. Whoever had done this had been watching me, waiting, moving silently enough that I had not noticed them in the dark. I checked my phone again. No signal. Panic started to build. The nearest town was miles away, and the dirt road leading back was steep, winding, and treacherous. I packed my things as quickly as possible, planning to leave immediately. But as I approached the car, I saw something else. The driver's side window was slightly cracked open. I was certain I had locked it the night before. My hands shook as I slid into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. The moment I drove off, a realization hit me. The figure, whoever or whatever had been circling the cabin, could be following me. Every rustle of the trees along the road made me flinch. Every shadow in the rearview mirror made me glance nervously. I drove faster, gripping the wheel tightly, eyes scanning the forest lining the road. Hours passed. The dirt road eventually gave way to the main highway. Relief washed over me, though I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been tracking me, at least for part of the journey. Once I reached the nearest town, I stopped at a gas station and reported the incident to the local authorities. They were skeptical but noted the footprints near the cabin, explaining that remote areas like this sometimes attracted people who watched isolated properties for reasons unknown, possibly for burglary, possibly worse. I didn't go back to the cabin. Later, I learned from the authorities that similar incidents had occurred in that region. Isolated cabins visited by unknown individuals who left no obvious evidence, sometimes moving silently around the area, observing, but rarely causing direct harm. The thought that someone had spent the night near me, unseen, while I sat inside, terrified but unaware of the extent, lingered long after. In the end, I realized the only reason I had survived the night unscathed was luck, preparation, and maintaining a rational mind despite the fear. I had fire, light, and a plan to escape. I had observed, stayed calm, and acted decisively when daylight came. The experience left me shaken but also strangely empowered. I had faced real, tangible fear, entirely human in nature, and survived because of careful thinking, caution, and vigilance. Even years later, I remember the smell of the damp wood, the sound of branches tapping against the cabin, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched. It taught me to respect isolation, to prepare for the unexpected, and above all, to never underestimate the presence of other humans in the wilderness. The cabin itself remains empty now, probably abandoned, but I can still picture it clearly. The small windows staring blankly at the forest, the firewood stacked in the corner, the footprints pressed into the wet soil, silent witnesses of a night I survived by a thread, and I never returned. I had always loved the idea of being alone in the woods. The quiet, the isolation, and the simple, raw connection to nature appealed to me in a way that nothing else did. I had planned this trip for months, mapping out the area I wanted to explore, researching cabins that were available, and stocking up on supplies I thought I would need. I wasn't someone who took risks lightly. I had done my homework. I was prepared, or at least I thought I was. The cabin I chose was tucked deep in the forest, far from any main road, with only a narrow, unpaved path leading to it. When I drove up, I could feel the weight of the trees around me pressing in. They were tall and thick, older than anything I had ever seen in my life. Their branches tangled high above, filtering the sunlight in patches that danced across the dirt road. The air smelled crisp, wet, and earthy, and I could hear the faint rustle of leaves moving in the wind, though the trees themselves barely moved. It was the kind of quiet that makes every small sound feel loud, every creak or snap amplified in the stillness. I parked my car at the edge of the path and took my backpack. The cabin itself was small, made of logs, with a steep roof that looked like it had been built decades ago. It had the faint smell of pine and mildew, and the wood felt rough under my fingers. There were no neighbors in sight, no signs of life for miles, and the isolation hit me harder than I expected. I told myself it was exactly what I wanted. Inside, the cabin was simple but serviceable. There was a small kitchen with a gas stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a wood-burning stove in the corner. The bedroom had a mattress on the floor, a thin blanket, and a small dresser with a few drawers. I unpacked my things slowly, deliberately, making a mental note of the layout. There was a small window that looked out into the dense trees behind the cabin, but it was high enough that I couldn't see much beyond the trunks. That was fine. I liked knowing I was contained within the small, safe space I had claimed for myself. The first night was uneventful. I had dinner, lit the stove, and read a book by the dim, flickering light of a lantern. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, and I could hear what I thought were animals rustling in the underbrush, but I didn't care. I felt safe. The kind of safe you feel when you are completely alone and in control. It was the second night when things started to feel off. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of a branch tapping against the window. It was a slow, deliberate tap, almost like someone was testing the glass. I froze, listening, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. But the sound came again, and it wasn't random. It was steady, rhythmic, like someone moving carefully through the trees outside. I didn't move for a long time, just listening. Then suddenly the tapping stopped. Everything went back to the soft, natural sounds of the forest, and I told myself I had imagined it. The next morning, I went outside to inspect the area around the cabin. The ground was soft from recent rain, and there were tracks I didn't recognize. Deep, heavy footprints that seemed too large to be human, but the shape suggested otherwise. I felt a chill in my chest. Maybe it was a deer, maybe something else. I had no way to be sure. I didn't tell myself it was dangerous, but the thought lingered as I went about my day. Over the next few days, the feeling of being watched grew. I couldn't see anyone, but sometimes I would catch a movement in the trees that didn't seem like a deer or a small animal. Once I thought I saw a shadow shift too quickly to be natural, but when I blinked, it was gone. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my hikes and exploring the area, but the sensation followed me everywhere. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of unease, but it grew sharper every day. One evening, I returned from a long hike and noticed something strange. My backpack, which I always left in the same spot near the stove, had been moved slightly. Not drastically, just enough that it caught my eye. I checked my supplies and nothing was missing, but the movement alone was enough to send my mind racing. I told myself I must have shifted it subconsciously, but a small voice in the back of my head whispered that wasn't true. That night, I slept poorly. Every sound seemed amplified. The wind rattling the roof, the trees creaking, the animals moving. And then, around 2 a.m., I heard it again. A deliberate, slow tapping, this time on the cabin wall itself. My heart leapt into my throat. I froze, listening, counting seconds. The tapping continued, slow, measured. Not random, not natural. It moved along the wall in a pattern, as if someone were walking their fingers across the wooden logs. My mind raced through every possibility. An animal? A human? But who would be out here? I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening. Every time I thought it had stopped, it would start again, sometimes closer to the window, sometimes along the back wall. I didn't sleep. I didn't want to. I sat by the stove with a small knife in my hand, my eyes scanning the dark corners of the room, my ears straining for every sound. The forest outside felt alive, not in a comforting way, but in a way that made my skin crawl. The next day, I didn't leave the cabin. I reinforced the doors and windows, made sure nothing was loose that could be opened from the outside, and sat in a constant state of vigilance. I had enough supplies to last a week, but the mental strain was growing. Every sound, every shadow, every movement in the trees made me tense, waiting for something that never came. On the third night, I woke to a sound that made my blood run cold. It wasn't tapping this time. It was a low, dragging noise, like someone or something was moving heavy objects across the ground outside. It circled the cabin, slow, methodical, making me feel trapped in a spider's web. I pressed myself against the wall, silent, trying not to breathe too loudly, praying it would go away. But it didn't. Hours passed. I don't know how many. I lost track of time. By morning, the forest was calm again. I looked outside and saw marks on the ground, scrapes, deep lines through the dirt, leading away from the cabin into the thicker part of the woods. Something had been out there, something large and strong enough to leave those marks. I checked my supplies again. Nothing missing, nothing taken, but the sense of violation was deep, raw, impossible to shake. For the next few days, I stayed inside, hardly eating, hardly sleeping, just watching and listening. I noticed small things changing, the way the wind moved, the way shadows fell, the way the forest seemed to press closer to the cabin. I could feel eyes on me, even when I knew no one was there. I started carrying the knife everywhere, even when I used the bathroom or went to check the fire outside. I felt cornered, hunted, and there was nowhere to run. Eventually, I realized I couldn't stay. I had no way of knowing what was out there, and the fear was consuming me. I planned my escape carefully. I would wait until midday when the light was strongest and move quickly to the car, staying low and hidden among the trees. I packed only what I needed, leaving behind anything that would slow me down, and I prepared myself mentally for a sprint through the forest. The day I left, I moved slowly at first, listening. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. I kept my knife in hand and my eyes on the shadows. The tracks from the previous nights were gone, as if whatever had been following me had left, but I couldn't let my guard down. My heart pounded in my chest with every step, every twig snapping underfoot. When I finally reached the clearing where I had left my car, I froze. The dirt road leading out of the forest had been disturbed. Deep, heavy tracks ran alongside my path, parallel to the car. Someone or something had been following me all the way. My hands shook as I opened the door, sliding inside, locking it immediately. I didn't look back. I didn't breathe until I was driving, tires crunching over the gravel, heart racing, eyes scanning the tree line for movement. It took hours to get back to civilization. Every turn, every hill, every stretch of trees made me tense. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but the further I drove, the more the fear began to fade. By the time I reached the first gas station, I felt like I was breathing normally again. I called a friend, told them I needed to be picked up, and sat in the parking lot, shaking and exhausted. The experience left me changed. I realized how unprepared I was for true isolation, how small and vulnerable a person can feel when surrounded by silence, darkness, and the unknown. I never went back to that cabin. The forest, the tall trees, the tracks, the tapping, they stayed with me in vivid memory. I couldn't explain what had been out there, and maybe I never would. But I knew one thing. I had survived, and that survival depended entirely on staying calm, being vigilant, and trusting my instincts. In the weeks after the trip, I slowly processed what had happened. I researched the area, talked to rangers, and read reports about wildlife and other visitors. Nothing explained it entirely. No one had reported anything unusual. The only thing I could do was accept that some things in the forest are beyond our understanding, not in a supernatural way, but in a deeply practical, real sense. The world can be dangerous, even when it seems quiet. Eventually, I found a way to reconcile the experience. I started hiking and exploring again, but always in groups, always with communication, always with safety in mind. I still loved the forest, but the naive sense of invincibility I had carried before was gone. The memory of those nights, of the tapping, of the tracks circling my cabin, stayed with me, a reminder of the thin line between comfort and terror when you are truly alone. I learned to respect it, to move carefully, and to always prepare for the unexpected. Looking back, I realized that the cabin had been perfect in one way. It had forced me to confront fear in its rawest form, without any distractions, without any easy explanations. The experience was terrifying, yes, but it also taught me discipline, caution, and resilience. I survived, and that survival was complete, tangible, and undeniable. I walked away with my life, my mind intact, and a new respect for the quiet, hidden dangers of the wilderness. That knowledge, I understood, was priceless. I never liked being alone in the woods, but I thought I could handle a weekend at the cabin. It was far from the nearest town, tucked deep in the mountains, the kind of place where the road stopped and nature swallowed everything else. The cabin belonged to my uncle, who had died a few years back, leaving it to me. He had always joked that it was a perfect place to disappear, and at the time I laughed, thinking it was just a joke. I had spent years in the city, surrounded by people and noise, and the idea of solitude seemed peaceful. I didn't think much about danger. I just thought about quiet mornings, the smell of pine, and maybe a little fishing. I packed my car with food for 3 days, a stack of firewood, extra blankets, and the tools I thought I might need: a flashlight, a hatchet, and a small hunting knife. My uncle's cabin was primitive, without electricity or running water, but I liked that kind of simplicity. I liked the idea of leaving my phone on the dashboard and disconnecting. The drive was long. At first, the road was paved, then it turned into gravel, then dirt, then nothing but ruts carved into the forest floor. At some point, I realized that if I got stuck, I might be on my own for hours before anyone passed. But it was still daylight, and I felt confident. I parked at the small clearing where the cabin sat. It was a single-story wooden structure, rough and weathered, but solid. Moss and small vines grew along the walls, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. I could see smoke stains from years of a fireplace being used. I took a deep breath. The air smelled sharp, fresh, like rain that had just fallen. The first thing I did was unload my gear and stack the firewood. The cabin had 2 small rooms, one with a few old beds and a kitchen area, the other with a table and chairs. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, and I realized no one had been here for months. The windows were grimy, letting in just enough light to see. I lit the fireplace, and the smoke curled up the chimney, filling the room with warmth. That night, I slept with the fire low, feeling the cabin creak as the wind shifted. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Occasionally, I would hear a snapping branch outside or the distant howl of some animal, but nothing seemed threatening. The next day, I woke early, had a simple breakfast of canned beans heated over the fire, and decided to explore the area. There was a narrow trail that led up the hill behind the cabin. I followed it, curious to see the view from the top. The path was overgrown and uneven, and I slipped a few times on loose rocks. By noon, I reached a plateau. From there, I could see the dense forest stretching for miles, rivers winding through the valleys, and the jagged peaks of the mountains on the horizon. I sat on a rock for a while, breathing hard, feeling a mix of exhaustion and awe. As I started to head back, I realized that the trail I had followed seemed less defined on the way down. I had been so focused on reaching the top that I hadn't memorized any markers. The forest all looked the same. Pine trees with dark bark, patches of ferns, rocks covered in moss. I kept walking, thinking I would eventually see the cabin, but after an hour, I didn't recognize anything. My stomach sank. The sun was moving lower, and shadows stretched across the trees. I tried retracing my steps, but every turn seemed wrong. Panic started to settle in. I knew I needed to stay calm, but the fear began gnawing at me. I decided to stop moving and listen. The forest was alive with sounds. The distant rush of water, birds squawking in the trees, insects buzzing. But there was something else too, subtle and unsettling. The occasional crack of a branch, like someone walking, though I could see no one. I forced myself to take a deep breath. I reminded myself that I was alone. There was no one else here. I couldn't let fear cloud my judgment. I decided to climb a small hill to see if I could spot the cabin from above. From there, I thought I might find a landmark. When I reached the top, I saw a faint trail of smoke rising far in the distance. Relief flooded through me. That had to be the cabin. I hurried down the hill, navigating carefully through roots and rocks, counting each step, trying to keep the smoke in sight. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was almost gone. I was shaking from exhaustion and fear, but I made it. I didn't even notice that my hands were bleeding from scratches until I sat on the porch and looked down. That night, I made a bigger fire, letting it roar to keep me warm and to give me a sense of security. I ate a small meal, but my appetite was gone. The sounds of the forest seemed louder than ever. Rustling leaves, distant snapping branches, and a low, constant hum that I couldn't identify. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind, and trying to keep my mind occupied. I tried to imagine that everything outside was harmless. Deer, birds, raccoons, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. The third day was the worst. I had slept fitfully, waking at odd hours to the sound of movement outside. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or an animal, but each time I opened my eyes, I felt like I was being watched. That morning, I went out to fetch more firewood. I had noticed that the stack I had made was lower than expected. I was certain I had stacked enough for the weekend, but it seemed someone or something had moved some of it. My stomach tightened, my heart racing. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a bear or a raccoon. I grabbed my hatchet and went to work, stacking the wood higher and making sure the fire could last through the night. As the afternoon came, I decided I needed to gather water from the nearby stream. I had only enough bottled water for one more day, and the thought of running out terrified me. I filled my backpack with empty bottles and made my way down the faint path to the stream. The water was cold and clear, flowing swiftly over smooth rocks. I filled my bottles, careful not to slip, and when I looked up, I saw something strange. Footprints in the mud along the bank. They weren't mine. They were human. I froze. They were large, booted prints, leading from the woods to the stream and back again. My mind raced. How could someone be out here? The nearest road was miles away, and the forest was thick. I didn't see anyone, but the tracks were fresh. I returned to the cabin as quickly as I could, keeping my head down, looking behind me every few steps. I locked the door and slid a chair in front of it, thinking it would give me a sense of control. I sat down, feeling my back pressed against the wall, staring at the shadows in the corners of the room. Every sound made me flinch. A branch tapping against the window, the wind shifting, the rustle of leaves. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat, clutching my knife, listening, waiting. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay. I had to get out. The idea of hiking out through the forest terrified me, but staying felt worse. I packed my gear carefully, making sure nothing was left behind, and I left the cabin as quietly as possible. I knew I couldn't take the main path I had come in on. It was too easy to be followed, and I had no idea if someone or something was watching. I remembered seeing a ridge on the other side of the clearing when I first arrived. I decided to head that way, hoping it would lead me to another road or at least higher ground where I could see a town. The hike was grueling. The terrain was steep and uneven, and I had to use my hands to pull myself up in some areas. My muscles ached. My fingers were raw from gripping rocks, and my clothes were torn. I kept my eyes on the horizon, looking for any sign of civilization. Hours passed. My energy drained. I took short breaks, hiding behind trees or large rocks to catch my breath and make sure no one was behind me. The forest had grown quieter, almost too quiet, as if it had been holding its breath along with me. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing at the top of a ridge. Below me, I could see a thin ribbon of asphalt winding through the trees. My heart leaped. There was a car on the road, headlights off, but it meant people were near. I didn't wait. I ran down the slope as fast as my legs could carry me, sliding on loose dirt and grabbing at branches to keep from falling. The forest seemed endless, but the road was closer than I thought. I stumbled onto it just as dusk was falling. The car saw me immediately, stopping a few feet away. I waved frantically, my voice hoarse, my clothes covered in mud and scratches. The driver got out, an older man, and asked if I was okay. I shook, barely able to speak, pointing back toward the forest. He nodded, motioning for me to get in. I sat in the car, trembling, watching the forest shrink behind us as we drove. The man didn't ask many questions. He drove slowly, taking a longer, safer route to the nearest town. By the time we arrived, darkness had fully fallen. I went straight to the police station and reported everything. The cabin, the strange footprints, the feeling of being watched. They noted the location, said they would investigate, but I knew I wouldn't be going back there. Weeks later, I returned once more, not to stay, but to retrieve some belongings with proper authorities and friends. The cabin looked the same, but the air felt different, heavier somehow. The tracks around the stream were gone, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I packed everything and left, locking the cabin for the last time. Even now, years later, I still think about that weekend. I think about how easy it is to get lost, how vulnerable you are when you're truly alone in the wilderness, and how small the line is between solitude and danger. I learned to respect the woods in a way I never had before. I never went back, and I never will. The cabin still sits there, deep in the mountains, a quiet place that hides secrets, and I know better than to try to uncover them. I had been planning this trip for months. The cabin was tucked deep in the mountains, far away from the nearest town, where the nearest neighbor was at least a 10-mile drive down a winding dirt road. I wanted to be alone, to disconnect from everything. My life had been heavy with work, bills, and endless responsibilities, and the thought of spending a week entirely on my own in the woods had become a kind of obsession. I imagined myself reading by the fire, hiking quietly through untouched trails, cooking over a small stove, and falling asleep to the gentle creak of the wooden cabin settling under the night sky. I didn't expect that, in reality, the solitude would twist into something far more frightening than I could have imagined. The drive up was long and exhausting. The road turned from paved to gravel, then to dirt, winding up steep inclines and around sharp corners. The mountains rose around me like walls, and the trees grew dense, blocking out most of the late afternoon sunlight. I had printed directions from the cabin owner and double-checked every turn. I could see the cabin from the road as I turned the final bend. A small wooden structure, weathered, with a single porch and a chimney that looked unused. The place looked abandoned, though the cabin owner had assured me it was ready for guests. I parked, stretched, and carried my bags up to the porch. The air smelled of pine and wet earth, the kind of scent that makes the lungs ache with freshness. I unlocked the cabin door and stepped inside. The inside was small but cozy. A narrow kitchen with an old stove, a table with 2 chairs, a living space with a worn couch, and a fireplace dominated the center of the room. Upstairs, there was a loft with a mattress and blankets. I left my bags by the door, turned on the small electric lamp, and breathed a little easier. This was exactly what I wanted: quiet, alone, disconnected. The first day passed uneventfully. I unpacked, made myself a simple dinner, and explored the small surroundings of the cabin. There was a stream about 50 yards from the cabin, a small clearing surrounded by dense trees, and a trail that disappeared into the forest. The cabin felt completely isolated, and I found a strange comfort in it. That night, I lit a fire in the fireplace and sat on the couch, staring at the flickering flames. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, making long shadows that seemed to stretch across the walls. I went to bed early, the darkness of the loft enclosing me like a heavy blanket. On the second day, I decided to take a longer hike. I packed water, a small first aid kit, some snacks, and a flashlight in my backpack. The trail started easy enough, winding through thick pine forests, but soon the path narrowed, and the trees became more tangled. I noticed fallen branches and the occasional animal tracks. Deer, maybe foxes, but nothing that caused real concern. I felt a light thrill being deep in the wilderness, where no one else seemed to exist. Hours passed. I followed the trail until I reached a small hill with a view of the valley below. The wind was strong up there, cutting against my jacket. I took photos, breathed the cold air, and began heading back toward the cabin as the sun started to dip low behind the peaks. I made a mistake. Instead of carefully marking my route, I relied on memory and thought I could recognize landmarks. The forest was denser than I expected, and soon the trail was lost beneath a carpet of needles and broken branches. Every tree looked the same, every incline and bend confusingly familiar yet different. I realized I had been walking in circles. My heart started to pound as the daylight diminished. I tried retracing my steps, but it was useless. Panic started to creep in. I checked my phone, no signal. That fact alone made the isolation feel heavier. I kept walking, hoping I would find something familiar. Hours passed, the shadows stretching longer and blending into a dark, indistinct mass. By the time I admitted that I was truly lost, the sun had set completely. The forest became a labyrinth of darkness, shapes looming where there were none, every sound amplified, branches snapping, leaves rustling. It all seemed closer than it was. I found a small clearing and decided to stay put for the night. I had a small pocket flashlight and a knife in my pack. I tried to start a fire using dry twigs, but the ground was damp, and the attempt failed. I wrapped myself in my jacket and huddled against a fallen log, listening to every sound. Hours dragged. I felt watched, though I knew logically it was just my mind playing tricks. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl made me flinch. I tried to control my breathing, reminding myself that I wasn't alone in the sense of other humans being present. But the forest itself seemed alive, vast, and indifferent to my fear. That night, I barely slept, curling into myself under the weight of the cold and unease. When morning came, I forced myself to move. I retraced the steps I thought might lead me back, paying careful attention to landmarks, moss on trees, the sound of the distant stream. Hours passed, and I grew more exhausted and thirsty. The sun climbed high, baking the top of my head, while my legs ached from constant walking. I started to panic again, fear gnawing at the edges of rational thought. I considered shouting, hoping someone might hear me, but the forest swallowed my voice instantly. My stomach growled. I hadn't eaten since the night before. I forced myself to keep moving, telling myself the cabin was out there. I just had to find it. By late afternoon, I stumbled across a stream. Relief hit me in a wave. I followed the sound of running water, knowing that the cabin had a stream nearby. As I walked, the trees thinned slightly, and I glimpsed the familiar shape of the cabin through a patch of brush. My heart leaped. I ran the last few yards, tripping over roots, scraping my hands, but finally, I reached the porch. The door was exactly as I had left it. I went inside, collapsed onto the couch, exhausted and shaking. That experience left me hollow, my sense of security permanently fractured. I realized how fragile the illusion of safety was in the woods. I sat for hours, staring at the empty walls, trying to calm my pulse, my mind still spinning with fear and relief intertwined. That night, I stayed inside entirely, building a proper fire and sitting close to it, checking the locks on the doors repeatedly. The wind outside rattled the cabin, a relentless reminder of how alone I truly was. Around midnight, I heard something unusual, a heavy, deliberate step on the porch outside. I froze. The sound repeated, slow and methodical. My heart leapt. I thought maybe it's an animal, but the steps were too large, too careful. I moved to the window, peeking through the dim light of the fire, but I saw nothing. The wind had stopped, and the forest fell silent, oppressive. My rational mind told me it could be a branch fallen by wind, a raccoon, anything, but fear clawed at my chest. I stayed by the fireplace until dawn, flashlight in hand, waiting for sunlight to return and with it some semblance of safety. When morning finally came, I explored the perimeter of the cabin cautiously. There were footprints, large and heavy, leading away from the porch and into the trees. Not animal tracks, human. My stomach sank. Someone had been outside while I slept. I felt violated, vulnerable. I checked the cabin for anything missing. Everything was in place, but the awareness that someone had been close enough to touch the door terrified me. I realized that being alone in the wilderness wasn't just a romantic isolation. It carried real risk. I began to understand that even a small, seemingly safe cabin could become a trap in the wrong circumstances. Over the next day, I reinforced the cabin as best as I could. I tied makeshift barricades with rope, checked the locks, and kept a fire ready to burn through the night. I ventured outside only briefly, keeping close to the cabin, wary of every sound. My food supply was low. I had underestimated how much preparation it takes to survive fully isolated. Anxiety built as night fell again, and I stayed vigilant. The wind picked up, rattling branches, and I kept my flashlight ready. I slept in short bursts, every noise waking me, every shadow triggering my adrenaline. By the third night, I had accepted that my plan to be alone had crossed into something dangerous. I had no idea who had been outside, but I assumed they might return. I kept a low profile, avoided leaving the cabin, and decided that I needed to call for help. I had a satellite phone as a backup, and using it, I contacted the cabin owner. They were shocked to hear someone had been outside and immediately called local authorities. I spent the rest of the day organizing myself for departure, keeping everything ready in case someone returned. I slept minimally, and by the early morning hours, I heard nothing more unusual. It seemed the intruder hadn't come back. When the authorities arrived, they scouted the area. They found more tracks in the surrounding woods, evidence that someone had been watching the cabin for days. They suggested that the area, while generally quiet, sometimes drew people looking to hide or escape for unknown reasons. I packed my belongings under their supervision, feeling an immense sense of relief but also an ongoing weight of anxiety. Driving away from the cabin, I looked back once. It sat quietly among the trees, entirely ordinary from the outside. Yet for me, it would always carry the memory of fear, isolation, and the real vulnerability of being completely alone in the wilderness. I never returned. The weeks afterward were hard. The memory of the steps on the porch, the silent observation, the endless dark woods haunted me. I learned to respect preparation and isolation in a way I hadn't before. I realized that the wilderness is beautiful but indifferent, and humans can be a greater danger than any imagined ghost. I took steps to process the experience, speaking to friends, exercising, and slowly returning to normal routines. The cabin had been my escape, but it had also shown me that being truly alone carries risks far beyond solitude. My life went back to normal in the practical sense, but I carried a deep awareness of vulnerability that I hadn't had before. A lasting lesson from the mountains, the cabin, and the shadowed figure that had walked just outside my door. I had been driving for hours along narrow, winding roads, deeper and deeper into the mountains, where the trees grew thick and the air smelled damp and cold. The sky was gray, almost as if it were warning me of something, though I ignored the feeling at first. My plan was simple: spend a weekend in a remote cabin, away from phones, noise, and everything. I needed solitude, a break from work and city life. The cabin was supposed to be small, wooden, tucked into the edge of a forest, with only a faint dirt path leading to it. When I finally spotted it through the dense trees, I felt relief and a strange little thrill. It looked exactly like the pictures online. Worn wood, a slanted roof, a small porch with peeling paint, and windows clouded with dust and condensation. The setting was beautiful but isolated, far beyond where neighbors or even other travelers could be. I parked the car, turned off the engine, and immediately noticed how quiet it was. There was no wind, no birds, not even the occasional sound of distant water. The silence was sharp, like a weight pressing on my ears. I grabbed my backpack, which contained food, water, a small stove, blankets, and a lantern. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and the smell of old wood mixed with damp earth hit me instantly. Dust floated in the narrow beams of light that entered through the small windows. The cabin had one main room, a small kitchen area to the side, and a loft above that could serve as a sleeping area. The floorboards were uneven, and some of them groaned under my weight, but otherwise it was livable. I dropped my bag and began unpacking, arranging things neatly on a counter, trying to ignore the unease that kept settling in the pit of my stomach. The first night came quickly. I lit the lantern and stove, boiled water, and cooked a simple meal. Outside, I could hear the occasional rustle in the underbrush, but I told myself it was just animals, the kind that lived in forests. I tried to relax by reading a book, but every time I heard a sharp snap from outside, I froze. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but the sounds kept coming, like tiny bursts of movement around the cabin. It wasn't the wind. The air was still. My anxiety grew slowly, in that slow creeping way that makes your skin crawl, but I dismissed it as paranoia. After all, I had spent plenty of nights in the woods before. At some point, I decided to check the surroundings. I stepped outside, the wooden porch creaking under my weight, and shone a flashlight into the dark forest. The trees were close, their branches reaching out like arms. Shadows shifted in the distance, and I had to remind myself that it was probably just leaves or rocks. My eyes strained, trying to pierce the darkness. For hours, I patrolled the small clearing around the cabin, moving slowly, careful not to make too much noise. The feeling of being watched became almost unbearable, but there was nothing visible. Still, every time I turned my head, it seemed like a shadow moved in the periphery of my vision. Sleep came fitfully. I set the lantern near the bed, and every little noise in the cabin made me tense. The wind didn't blow that night, yet there were scratching noises coming from outside the cabin walls, the kind of sound that makes you stop breathing. It sounded like claws scraping against wood. I lay awake for hours, listening, staring at the ceiling, my mind cycling through all the rational explanations. Raccoons, squirrels, perhaps a deer that had gotten too close. But the noise was too deliberate, too precise. It wasn't random movement. It followed a pattern, like something or someone was pacing, circling the cabin. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined shapes moving in the corners of the room. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, but the unease never left completely. The next morning, I tried to shake off the tension. I went outside to collect firewood and noticed something unusual. Footprints, large, uneven, but distinctly human, leading from the tree line to the back of the cabin. My heart started racing, and I moved slowly, examining them. They didn't match mine, and they weren't fresh, but they also weren't old. Probably from the night before. I couldn't see who or what made them, and the thought of someone wandering around while I slept made my stomach knot. I told myself that maybe it was another hiker or someone lost, but the area was rarely visited, and I had parked my car on the only road that led here. There shouldn't have been anyone else. Yet there were the tracks, clear in the soft dirt, leading toward the cabin and back into the trees. I decided to be extra cautious. I reinforced the windows and doors, checking that everything latched properly, and kept a knife within reach. Every sound became magnified. The rustling of leaves, the groan of the wooden structure, the distant scream of a bird. All of it set my nerves on edge. Hours passed, and I tried to keep busy with organizing supplies, cleaning the cabin, and keeping the fire going. I avoided going far from the porch. The sense of being watched didn't leave. I started noticing small things. The kind of things that aren't usually noticed in a cabin, like the way a branch tapped rhythmically against the roof or how shadows pooled in strange ways across the walls. My mind kept circling back to the footprints. Someone had been near my cabin, close enough to see me, to know I was alone. By the second night, the tension had built into a tangible pressure. I had eaten sparingly, drank water, and paced the cabin, checking windows repeatedly. The sounds outside grew louder, closer. Sometimes I thought I heard voices, but it was more like the wind or echoes bouncing off trees. Then came the banging. Not loud, not continuous, but a deliberate single strike, like someone testing the door or walls. My first instinct was to hide, to avoid being noticed. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, moving cautiously to the door, but I couldn't see anything. The darkness around the cabin seemed to press in, thick and suffocating. I debated leaving immediately, but the idea of walking through the forest in the night without a clear path was terrifying too. The road was a long walk away, and it was already pitch black. I stayed awake, listening to the sounds of someone, or something, moving outside. Every step I took inside the cabin seemed to echo, and I felt the walls close in. The banging returned intermittently, along with scratching, faint whispering noises that I couldn't make sense of. Hours passed, and my fear turned into a cold, focused alertness. I knew I had to be ready for anything. I barricaded the door with a chair, moving silently to position myself near the kitchen area, where I had a clear view of the door and windows. My mind ran through possibilities. A lost hiker, a trespasser, someone dangerous. The uncertainty was worse than anything else. I realized that panicking would only make me careless, and carelessness here could be fatal. At dawn, the noises stopped. The forest returned to its quiet state, almost unnaturally calm. I ventured outside slowly, scanning the area. The footprints were gone, as if whoever had made them had vanished in the night. I searched for anything else, but there was no sign of intrusion beyond those prints. Relief mingled with residual fear. I was alive and nothing had happened, but I couldn't shake the knowledge that someone had been there, close enough to know I was alone. The incident left me hyper-aware, examining every shadow, every movement, with a heightened sense of vigilance. I realized that isolation could be dangerous, not because of the forest itself, but because of the unpredictability of other humans. Nature could be controlled. People could not. I spent the next day preparing to leave. I packed all my things carefully, extinguished the fire, and checked that nothing was left behind. I walked the perimeter of the cabin one last time, ensuring that all windows were shut and nothing seemed out of place. The forest seemed calm now, indifferent to my presence. The road back was long, and I drove slowly, eyes scanning the tree line constantly. Every shadow made me tense. Every rustle of leaves made my heart race. But gradually, the tension began to ease as I descended into more populated areas, where houses, cars, and the faint sound of distant life reminded me that I wasn't alone anymore. The sense of isolation that had been both thrilling and terrifying faded, replaced by the comfort of civilization. Looking back on it, the weekend in the cabin was a lesson in vigilance and awareness. I realized that fear doesn't always come from fantastical sources. It often comes from the unpredictability of the real world. The mountains and forests are beautiful, but they are also unforgiving in their isolation. People can be just as dangerous, if not more so, than any wild animal. I made sure afterward to tell friends and family exactly where I had gone, to carry a more reliable means of communication, and to never underestimate the risks of being alone in a remote place. The cabin itself remained, as silent and indifferent as when I had left, a reminder that the world continues outside of our control, and that being prepared and alert is often the only defense against unexpected danger. Even now, when I drive past a mountain road or see a forested area that seems empty, I remember that weekend. I remember the cold, the silence, the footsteps outside the cabin at night, and the precise fear of knowing someone could have been watching, close enough to touch the walls, and yet I would never see them. The fear was real, grounded, and human, and surviving it left me with a clear understanding. Isolation is powerful, the wilderness is silent, and human caution is the only thing between safety and danger. I never returned to that cabin, but the lessons I carried from it shaped every trip I made after. I now approach solitude with respect, awareness, and preparation, knowing that real fear is not in stories or myths, but in the careful, quiet observation of the world and its people. I had been planning the trip for months, imagining the quiet, the isolation, and the escape from the constant noise of the city. The cabin I found online was deep in the northern woods, miles away from any small town, and accessible only by a long dirt road that seemed to disappear into the trees. It was the kind of place I had always wanted, a real retreat where I could disconnect completely. When I drove up that winding road, the air itself felt different. It had that damp, earthy smell that comes after rain, mixed with the sharp scent of pine and moss. The sunlight barely reached the forest floor through the thick canopy, making the path ahead uneven and dappled with shadows. I parked the car on a small clearing just in front of the cabin and stepped out. The cabin was simple, made of logs, with a stone chimney that looked like it had been there for decades. Its windows reflected the surrounding forest, dark and silent. I carried my backpack up to the porch and unlocked the heavy wooden door. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of dust, old wood, and something that reminded me of damp blankets. The interior was small but functional. There was a living area with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with basic utensils, a small bedroom with a narrow bed, and a bathroom that, I assumed, worked with a septic system. Everything looked a little worn but well-maintained, the kind of place that had survived harsh winters and heavy storms. I set down my bag, pulled the windows open to let in some fresh air, and walked around, touching the rough wooden beams and inspecting the corners for any signs of critters. Everything was quiet, too quiet, and I had to remind myself that silence was part of why I had come here. I unpacked some food, set up a small table by the window, and made a simple meal. While eating, I watched the trees sway gently in the breeze, feeling the solitude settling in. As the sun dipped lower, the forest turned darker and more opaque. Shadows stretched across the cabin floor, and the sounds of the woods became sharper. The rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a branch, and the distant call of some bird I couldn't identify. I lit a small lantern and placed it on the table, its flickering light creating moving patterns on the walls. I felt calm but also a little tense, like my mind was straining to notice something it shouldn't. Night came fast. The cabin, cut off from the faint glow of distant towns, became a small island of light in a vast, dark forest. I closed the windows, locked the door, and turned on a battery-powered lantern in the bedroom. The quiet was overwhelming. Every tiny sound seemed amplified. The wind tapping against the roof, the creak of the wooden floorboards, the distant rustle of animals moving through the underbrush. I told myself it was normal, that the forest was alive, but my heart still jumped when I heard noises close to the cabin. I tried to read, but my eyes kept darting to the window, to the shadows outside. At some point during the night, I woke up to the sound of something heavy outside. It wasn't a branch falling or a deer moving. It was deliberate, slow, like someone or something was walking around the cabin. I froze, listening. The sound stopped and then started again, circling the perimeter. My first thought was that it could be a bear or another large animal. I had packed bear spray, and I had a flashlight within reach, but I had no idea what I would do if something actually tried to get in. I stayed still for hours, every nerve in my body taut, waiting for a sound to tell me that I was not alone. Eventually, the sounds faded, leaving me awake and staring at the ceiling until dawn. Morning brought relief, but also the strange feeling of vulnerability. I went outside to inspect the cabin's surroundings, looking for signs of animals or intruders. I found nothing unusual. No tracks, no disturbed foliage, nothing. But I couldn't shake the unease. The forest seemed denser than before, the trees forming walls around the clearing. I reminded myself that I had chosen this isolation, that I had planned for solitude, and that the noises of the night were probably just wildlife. I decided to keep busy. I chopped some firewood, cleaned the cabin, and collected water from the nearby stream. Each task required concentration, and it helped keep my mind from spiraling. Still, as the day went on, I noticed small things that unsettled me. My shoes, which I had left by the door, were slightly shifted. The chair I had placed by the window was not exactly where I had left it. Small, easily explained things, but my imagination made them sinister. I couldn't find any practical explanation, and yet I didn't want to admit to myself that someone might have been there while I slept. The second night was worse. The first night's noises had set my mind on edge. I had a plan this time. I barricaded the door with a wooden chair, keeping my flashlight and bear spray close. As darkness fell, the forest around the cabin seemed to come alive in a way I hadn't noticed before. Shadows moved quickly through the trees, and the sounds of animals or something heavier returned. This time, the noises were different. They weren't just circling. They were persistent, moving closer to the cabin. I stayed in the bedroom, watching the window with the lantern flickering beside me. At one point, I thought I saw movement right outside the window, a dark shape blending with the night. My heart slammed against my chest. I gripped the bear spray, breathing slowly, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the shadows. Hours passed. The noises eventually faded again, leaving only the occasional rustle of leaves. I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat in the bed, tense, listening to every detail of the night. By the first rays of light, I was exhausted and almost trembling. I needed to leave, but the cabin's remote location meant a long drive back on that rough dirt road. I needed to calm myself and plan my exit carefully. During the day, I inspected the cabin and the surrounding area more carefully. That's when I found something truly alarming. Footprints. Large, booted footprints that weren't mine circling the cabin. They were fresh. They weren't animal tracks. My stomach dropped, and for the first time, I realized that the noises weren't wildlife. Someone had been around the cabin. I checked the doors and windows. They were all locked, but there were subtle signs someone had tried the handles. My mind raced with possibilities, every scenario worse than the last. The isolation I had sought had become a dangerous trap. I made a plan. I needed to leave, and I needed to do it without attracting attention. I packed everything quickly, making sure nothing was left behind that could be used to track me. I kept an eye on the forest, the shadows, and the windows. I waited until noon when the sun was high and visibility was at its best. Then I unlocked the door, keeping the bear spray ready, and started walking toward my car. I moved slowly, scanning constantly. My heart was pounding with every crack of a branch, every bird call, every whisper of wind. When I reached the clearing, my car was there, exactly where I had left it, but I didn't stop. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The sound was deafening in the silence of the woods, but it was a relief. I kept my eyes on the treeline as I drove slowly down the dirt road, watching for movement. I saw nothing at first, but halfway down the road, I caught a glimpse of a dark figure between the trees. It didn't move quickly, just watched. I sped up, keeping the forest behind me in sight until I was back on the main road. Only when the trees were far behind me did I feel some measure of safety. The drive back to the nearest town took hours. I didn't stop until I reached a populated area, where there were other cars, people walking, stores open, and the hum of electricity and civilization. Only then did I feel my body begin to relax. I parked at a gas station, checked the perimeter, and breathed deeply. I realized that what I had experienced could have been dangerous, life-threatening even. The thought that someone had been watching me, circling my cabin at night, made me shiver. I reported the incident to the local authorities the next day. They took a statement, noting the isolation of the cabin, the footprints, and the possibility that someone had been living nearby or tracking cabins for theft or other crimes. They suggested I stay somewhere populated for a while and warned me about the dangers of isolated cabins. I realized that the fantasy of solitude I had clung to was fragile, and in some cases, deadly. Weeks later, I sold the cabin rental online. I couldn't bear the thought of going back, but I also carried a strange clarity. I had survived, and I had learned that isolation, while peaceful in theory, comes with real risks. The experience left me more aware, more cautious, and more appreciative of the simple presence of other people. I no longer romanticized solitude. Now I understood it in a different way. It was a privilege that came with responsibility, planning, and awareness of the dangers that could lurk just beyond the tree line. I kept the photographs I had taken, not for nostalgia, but as a record of what had happened. The forest remained beautiful in my memory, but it was no longer a safe or serene place in my mind. I had faced the reality of human danger in isolation and had come out alive. That knowledge and the lessons it carried stayed with me in every quiet moment thereafter, making me cautious but also grateful for the security of everyday life. I had always been drawn to isolation, to the quiet that came with being deep in the woods, away from the noise and the people. The city had exhausted me, its endless buzz, the constant pressure, the unrelenting feeling that I was just another face in a crowd, another pair of hands to fill someone else's demands. So when I found the cabin online, tucked away in the dense forests of northern Montana, I thought I had stumbled onto a little piece of freedom. The listing was simple: a small log cabin, fully equipped, only accessible by a narrow, gravel road that ended in a long, overgrown trail. The pictures showed a wooden structure, rustic but solid, with smoke curling gently from a stone chimney and a small porch with a rickety railing. It was surrounded by tall pines and firs, and from the looks of it, no one had been there for weeks, maybe months. The isolation felt perfect. I arrived late on a Thursday afternoon, the sun already low and sending long, orange streaks across the forest floor. The gravel road had become more of a dirt track after the last few miles, and I drove carefully, listening to the crunch of the tires over the loose stones. The trees grew closer together as I approached the cabin, their shadows stretching across the narrow road like silent warnings. I told myself it was just my imagination, the nervous excitement that always came with arriving somewhere completely alone. The cabin looked smaller in person than it had in the pictures, but sturdier, with thick logs and a solid roof. The door creaked when I pushed it open, but it moved without resistance. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old wood and cold ash, and I could see the remains of a fire in the stone fireplace. There were a few basic pieces of furniture: a small wooden table with 2 chairs, a bed in the corner with a thin mattress, and a kitchen counter with a sink and some cabinets. The electricity was off, but a stack of firewood sat near the hearth, dry and ready to burn. I set my bags down and moved slowly, touching the walls and tracing the edges of the windows, listening to the silence that wrapped around the cabin like a heavy blanket. I spent the next hour unpacking and organizing, lighting candles, and starting a small fire in the hearth. The smoke smelled strong at first, but soon it warmed the cabin and brought a sense of comfort. I made a simple meal with some canned beans and bread I had brought, and then I sat near the fire, letting the warmth seep into my bones. Outside, the wind began to pick up, rustling through the trees, making the branches scrape against each other. It was a soothing sound at first, rhythmic, almost musical, but as the night deepened, it took on a harsher, sharper edge, a reminder that I was not in control here. I tried to sleep, but the thin mattress offered little comfort. The wind howled around the cabin, and the wooden walls groaned under the pressure. Every crack in the floor, every snap of a twig outside, seemed amplified in the darkness. I told myself it was just the forest settling, just animals moving through the underbrush, but there was a part of me that couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, I woke early, feeling restless and tense despite the sleep I had managed to get. I dressed in layers and stepped outside, letting the cold air hit my face. The sun was barely rising, filtering through the dense trees in pale beams. I decided to explore the surrounding area, wanting to familiarize myself with the terrain in case of an emergency. The forest was thick, the ground uneven and covered in fallen branches and pine needles. I moved carefully, making mental notes of landmarks. A fallen log shaped like a bridge, a cluster of large boulders near a small stream, a patch of moss that glowed almost neon green in the morning light. As I walked, I felt the solitude keenly. There was no sound of humans, no distant engines or voices, only the occasional rustle of small animals and the whisper of the wind. It was exhilarating at first, but as the day wore on, it became oppressive. I realized that if something went wrong here, if I got hurt or lost, no one would know for hours, maybe even days. The thought made my chest tighten, but I pushed it aside, focusing on the trail markers I was making in my mind. Back at the cabin, I spent the afternoon cleaning and repairing minor things. A window latch was loose, a chair wobbled, the firewood needed stacking. I moved deliberately, taking my time, keeping my mind occupied. As evening approached, I prepared another fire and another simple meal. I noticed that the wind had changed direction. It came from the east now, colder, sharper, cutting through the gaps in the logs. I closed the windows and doors tightly, but the sound of the trees scraping against the roof was relentless. That night, I barely slept. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that made my stomach twist, the faint crunch of footsteps outside the cabin. I froze, straining to hear, but it stopped as quickly as it had started. My heart raced and I checked the locks on the door. Everything seemed secure. I told myself it was an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the pattern of the steps had sounded deliberate, too heavy for a small animal. I sat by the fire, trying to calm my thoughts, but sleep was impossible after that. The next day, I stayed inside as much as possible, moving only to gather firewood and check the perimeter. The isolation was no longer peaceful. It had turned tense, almost threatening. Every shadow felt exaggerated, every sound amplified. I realized that part of the fear wasn't just being alone, it was the uncertainty, the lack of control. The forest was beautiful, but it was indifferent to my presence, and that indifference was terrifying. By the third day, I had grown more cautious. I avoided wandering too far and kept a heavy branch nearby when I went outside. I started noticing small things that I had ignored before. Scratches on the wooden steps leading to the porch, broken branches near the cabin that didn't look like natural falls, footprints in the soft dirt around the perimeter. My mind raced with possibilities. Had someone been here before me? Was there someone still around? The thought made my stomach churn. I decided to set up makeshift alarms using cans and string around the cabin, a trick I had read about in a survival blog. It felt ridiculous, but it brought a small measure of security. I also moved heavier furniture in front of the doors at night. Each evening, I checked the locks, reinforced the windows, and kept a fire burning. My nerves were frayed, my sleep minimal, but I refused to leave. The cabin was mine for the week, and I wanted to see it through. On the fourth day, the weather turned. Rain began in the morning, soft at first, then heavy, drumming against the roof and making the forest floor slick with mud. The stream nearby swelled, and I realized that the little bridge I had noted earlier might be dangerous if I tried to cross it. I stayed inside, watching the rain blur the trees into indistinct shapes. It was both soothing and menacing, the sound of water masking other noises, but also making me aware of how vulnerable I was. In the afternoon, I decided to go out and secure more firewood despite the rain. I wore waterproof clothing and boots, moving carefully to avoid slipping on the wet ground. As I reached a small clearing, I froze. There were footprints, large, wet, human-like, leading from the woods directly toward the cabin. My heart pounded, and I quickly retraced my steps, keeping to the cover of trees. Back at the cabin, I checked every window and door, my hands trembling as I locked them again. The rain continued, relentless, and I realized that I was trapped in a cage of my own making. The forest had become a maze, the rain a wall. That night, I barely ate, barely moved, listening to every sound, every shift of wind and rain. The fire was my only comfort, its warmth and light keeping the darkness at bay. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. I stayed still, silent, trying to make myself invisible. The sounds persisted for a long time, and then, as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. I waited hours, convinced that anyone outside had left, but the fear lingered like a shadow. By the 5th day, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to get help or at least leave. The rain had stopped, leaving the forest damp and the air thick with the smell of wet earth and pine. I packed essentials, wrapped food in waterproof bags, and planned my route back to the gravel road. I moved cautiously, checking for any signs that someone might still be nearby. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves made me flinch. The walk back was tense. I stayed close to the trees, avoiding open clearings, constantly scanning for movement. The forest seemed alive, watching me, reminding me that I was alone and vulnerable. I didn't rush, but I didn't stop, and after what felt like hours, I finally reached the gravel road. The sight of my car was a relief so profound I almost cried. I jumped in, locked the doors, and drove away slowly at first, then faster, until the forest was behind me and the cabin was nothing more than a dark memory among the trees. When I finally returned home, the tension didn't immediately leave me. I kept checking the locks on my apartment doors, double-checking the windows. The cabin had left a mark, a reminder that isolation could be both beautiful and terrifying, that being completely alone in the wilderness could strip away all your sense of security. But in the end, I survived. I had endured the fear, the uncertainty, the very real possibility that someone or something might be out there watching. And that knowledge, harsh and uncomfortable, was strangely empowering. I had faced the worst of the solitude, and I had come back whole. The cabin, the forest, the footsteps, they remained in my memory, vivid and unrelenting. I never returned, but I often thought about it, the fear mingling with a strange, aching nostalgia. I understood then that survival wasn't about confrontation or bravery. It was about awareness, preparation, and the stubborn refusal to give up. The woods could scare me, isolate me, make me doubt myself, but they could never take away the fact that I had made it through, and that, more than anything, was a victory I would carry with me forever. I had been looking forward to the weekend for weeks. The city had been pressing down on me in a way I could not shake. The constant noise, the never-ending traffic, the people who always seemed to be in a rush but never really going anywhere. I needed a place where I could be alone, somewhere quiet, remote, and surrounded by the kind of nature that made you feel both small and alive. That's how I ended up driving deep into the mountains, following a dirt road that got narrower and bumpier with each mile. My destination was a small, isolated cabin I had rented for 2 nights. It was listed online as off the grid and completely private. That was exactly what I wanted. The last stretch of the road was rougher than I expected. Rocks stuck out from the ground in random patterns, and ruts cut deep grooves through the dirt. My car bounced over each one, my tires kicking up dust that clung to my windshield. I had driven on mountain roads before, but this one felt particularly lonely. There were no other cars, no signs of civilization, not even telephone poles. Just the trees, dense and tall, stretching up like silent watchers, and the smell of damp earth and pine. When I finally saw the cabin, relief hit me in a rush. It was small, made of rough-hewn logs, with a simple porch that had a single wooden chair on it. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and I realized I had never actually been here before. So maybe the previous renters had left a fire burning, or perhaps the owners had visited. Either way, it was comforting. I parked the car, turned it off, and for the first time in hours, I felt my shoulders drop and my chest loosen. The cabin looked sturdy, though simple. The door opened with a creak, revealing a single room with a small kitchenette along one wall, a wood-burning stove, a simple table, and a single bed. The floor was wooden, uneven in places, with cracks that showed years of wear. A small bathroom sat to one side with a sink, toilet, and a shower that looked like it had not seen use in a while. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and something else, something like damp fabric. It wasn't unpleasant, just old. I set down my bag and started to unpack. I had brought enough food for the weekend, some water, a few books, and my camera, which I often used to take photos of landscapes. I wanted this to be a weekend where I didn't see anyone, didn't talk to anyone, just absorbed the quiet. I built a fire in the stove, the small logs crackling as they caught flame. The heat spread slowly through the cabin, warm and dry, pushing out the faint chill that clung to the corners. By the time night fell, the sun had disappeared behind the mountains, and the forest outside was a solid wall of black. I lit a lantern and sat at the table, eating a simple dinner, feeling the isolation sink in fully. It was both calming and a little unsettling. I realized that in the silence, even the smallest sounds became loud. The wind moving through the trees sounded like it was coming closer to the cabin. The creak of the logs in the walls became almost like footsteps. I told myself it was nothing, just the cabin settling. I decided to go to bed early. The air was cool, the blanket rough but comforting. I lay there listening to the forest outside, hearing the occasional snap of a branch, the distant cry of an owl, things I had always thought were soothing but tonight seemed sharper, more pronounced. I drifted in and out of sleep, aware of every small noise, every rustle, every distant sound that might have been someone, or something, moving just outside. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a noise that made my stomach tighten. It was faint at first, a scraping sound coming from the side of the cabin. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I told myself it was an animal. Deer sometimes brushed against the sides of buildings, maybe a raccoon looking for food. My heart rate slowed, and I tried to return to sleep. But then it came again, this time louder. A slow, deliberate scraping, like something was dragging along the outside wall. I didn't want to go to the window, didn't want to look. I told myself it wasn't anything, that I was safe inside. But my body wouldn't relax. I stayed in bed, straining to hear more. The scraping continued intermittently, sometimes far, sometimes near. At one point, I thought I heard a low thump, like something heavy had hit the wall. My stomach tightened further. I decided I needed to know what was happening. Slowly, carefully, I got out of bed, grabbed my flashlight, and tiptoed toward the window. I peeked out through the glass, shining the beam into the darkness. Nothing, just the trees, thick and unmoving. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself I was imagining it. Then I saw something move, a shadow at the edge of the light. My pulse jumped. I crouched lower, watching, trying to convince myself it was just a tree branch swaying in the wind. But the shadow shifted in a way that trees don't shift. It was deliberate. I realized with a sinking feeling that someone or something was outside, not an animal. I had locked the door when I came in. I checked. The lock was intact. I didn't know how long they had been out there, or if they had been watching the cabin before I arrived. The thought made me shiver. I sat in bed for what felt like hours, listening to the occasional rustle, the faint movement outside. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. I wondered if they would go away, if they were just passing through. I thought about calling someone, but the cabin had no cell reception. The nearest town was miles away. I felt trapped, isolated, completely at the mercy of whoever or whatever was outside. Eventually, just before dawn, the noises stopped. Absolute silence. I didn't sleep again that night. When the first pale light touched the forest, I got dressed and slowly opened the door. The porch was empty. No footprints, no marks, nothing that suggested anyone had been there. Only the forest, calm and silent, the trees swaying slightly in the early morning breeze. I decided to stay another night. Maybe the events of the previous night had just been a coincidence. Maybe it really had been an animal. I kept my flashlight and my knife with me at all times, more for peace of mind than anything else. I did not leave the cabin except to check the perimeter briefly during the day. Everything seemed normal. The sun was high, the air fresh, the birds singing. Nothing to fear. But that night, the noises returned. This time, louder, closer. The scraping, the thumping, the occasional faint dragging sound. It was as if they were moving around the entire cabin, circling it, testing it. I stayed in bed again, barely breathing, flashlight at the ready. I could hear them shifting, moving, stopping, listening, watching. Hours passed. I counted them as best I could, the minutes stretching into a long, endless night. In the morning, I left the cabin as quickly as possible. I drove down the dirt road, my hands gripping the wheel, heart still pounding. When I finally reached a paved road, I stopped and took a deep breath. The city traffic and noise felt oppressive, but it also felt safe, normal, predictable. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin. I wondered if I had imagined everything, if it had been my mind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew it had not been imagined. Something had been there. Someone had been watching. The experience left me with a new understanding of isolation, of how fragile safety can feel when you are truly alone. Months later, I returned with a friend, not to stay, but to investigate. The cabin had been broken into. Windows had been tampered with, scratches on the walls, footprints in the dirt around the porch. Whoever had been there had been inside. There was no one around and no way to trace them. The cabin had been left completely empty, but the signs were undeniable. Someone had been there, watching, waiting, and testing the space before I had arrived. I never stayed there again. Couldn't. The sense of vulnerability, the memory of being trapped and alone, was too strong. But I learned something important that weekend. Nature is beautiful, isolation can be peaceful, but when you are truly alone in the wrong place, the reality of danger is real, immediate, and terrifying. And that understanding stayed with me. It changed the way I approached every cabin, every remote place, every forest I ever went into after that. I never assumed I was safe again. The experience left scars, not physical, but deep in my mind. I still dream about the scraping outside the walls, the shadow at the edge of the light. But those dreams taught me caution. They taught me to respect the unknown, not in a supernatural sense, but in a human one. People can be dangerous, and when you are alone, even a small cabin in the woods can become a trap. I learned to trust my instincts, to plan ahead, and to never underestimate how quickly isolation can turn into fear. That cabin is still there, empty now. I know the owners rent it out occasionally, but I cannot imagine going back. I tell myself the experience made me stronger, more aware, more careful. But part of me will always remember that night, the endless darkness, the scraping outside, and the feeling that someone, unknown and unseen, had been right there, waiting. And that memory, as unsettling as it is, has become a guide, a constant reminder of the thin line between safety and danger, and how quickly it can disappear.